Tonight we travel to a world that wore silk and smelled of bergamot and orange blossom, a world of polished mahogany doorways and calling cards left on silver trays in entrance halls that echoed like cathedrals. We are going to walk together through the upper rooms of Gilded Age America, through the parlours of women whose names were spoken in every society column from Newport to San Francisco, women whose dinner parties were studied like military campaigns, whose dresses were copied from Parisian sketches and stitched in workrooms that ran past midnight. These were the perfect socialites of the long American century, the women who held the social calendar in one gloved hand and a glass of cold champagne in the other. They were photographed in white furs and pearls. They smiled the practiced smile of women who had learned the smile in front of mirrors at the age of 9. They were known for their charity balls and their orchids, and their staircases curving like the inside of a nautilus shell. And behind every one of them, behind some of them at least, there was another life, a second ledger, a locked drawer, a telephone line into a world the society columns never named. Tonight we open those drawers. We move slowly. We linger in the rooms where the polish was thickest because the lacquer always hides the grain. Settle in, let the day go. There is no hurry here. We have all the time in the world. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. To understand the women in this story, we have to first understand the rooms they were born into, the wallpaper they grew up against, the nurseries with their painted clouds and their nurses in starched aprons, the long hallways of houses that had been built with money so new the paint had barely dried. We have to understand the precise shape of the cage before we can understand why some of the birds inside it learned to pick the locks. The American Gilded Age, as one of its earliest critics named it, was a country of newly minted fortunes draped in the borrowed plumage of older European wealth. Steamship money, railroad money, copper money, sugar money, oil money, banking money, all of it pouring into the harbours of New York and Boston and Philadelphia and Newport and Chicago, all of it desperate to be made respectable. And respectability in that age was the property of women. It was the wives and the daughters who polished the rough edges of the new American fortune, who hosted the dinners, who joined the right churches, who learned which fork to lift first, who taught their children to walk into a room as if they had been born there, even when they had been born above a tannery in Cleveland or in a wooden farmhouse in upstate New York. The houses they grew up in were strange compromises between aspiration and uncertainty. A Fifth Avenue mansion might have a ballroom in the French style, a library copied from an English country house, a smoking room panelled in dark Italian walnut, a breakfast room painted the pale green of a robin's egg, and a kitchen that smelled of the same yeast and butter and roasted onions that had filled every American kitchen for a century. The grandeur was assembled in pieces, like a costume sewn together from the wardrobes of older theatres. The girls who grew up in these houses moved through them like small, watchful guests. They learned the rhythms of the staff. They knew which footman would not tell on them when they slid down the banister. They knew which housekeeper kept lemon drops in her apron pocket. They knew the back stairs as well as they knew the front, and they knew, from the very earliest age, that they were being watched. Their mothers watched them. Their nurses watched them. The visiting aunts watched them. Most of all, society watched them, an invisible jury that took notes from the moment a girl was old enough to wear a sash. There were rules for everything. Rules for the angle of the curtsy. Rules for the height at which one held a teacup. Rules for which gloves matched which gowns at which time of day. Rules for whom one might speak to first at a ball, and for how long, and on what topics. There were rules for the thickness of the calling card and the size of the engraving, and the precise shade of cream the paper ought to be. There were rules for the shape of the envelope. There were rules for whether one used initials or a full name, and which initials and in what order. The rules were not written down. They were absorbed, the way a child absorbs the language of a household, by listening and by being corrected, gently at first and then less gently. A girl who could not learn the rules was a problem. A girl who learned them too well was a different kind of problem. A girl with the watchful patience of someone who has noticed that the rules are tools, and that tools, in the right hands, can be used to build almost anything. Many of the women we'll meet tonight were that second kind of girl. They learned the rules early, and they learned them deeply, and somewhere in the long afternoons of their childhoods, in the schoolrooms with the French tutors and the music masters and the dancing instructors, they began to understand a quiet, dangerous thing. They began to understand that society's rules were a kind of soft armour. The girl who wore the armour perfectly was almost invisible inside it. She could move anywhere. She could be seen and not seen, present and not present. The armour itself, the gleaming, ridiculous, suffocating armour of perfect femininity, was the most useful camouflage a person could possibly wear. Imagine one of these girls at the age of 10, in a green velvet dress with a wide collar of cream lace. Imagine her sitting on a low ottoman in her mother's bedroom, watching her mother at the dressing table. The dressing table is covered in cut glass bottles and silver brushes and small porcelain pots. Her mother is choosing earrings. The light is the warm, slow light of a late afternoon in autumn, the kind of light that turns dust into gold. Outside, somewhere very far away, a streetcar passes with a dim ringing of its bell. The girl watches her mother lift a single pearl and consider it in the lamplight, then set it down. She watches her mother lift a sapphire. She watches her mother decide, and she watches the deciding, and she understands without words that her mother has chosen the sapphires not because they match the dress, but because they will tell the woman across the dinner table something specific. The sapphires are a sentence. The pearls would have been a different sentence. The dress is a paragraph. The whole evening is a long, careful letter, and her mother is composing it without ink. That girl will grow up. She will marry well. She will host dinners of her own, and she will, perhaps, when the lights are low and the household has gone to sleep, sit at her own dressing table and choose what to say next. Some of what she will say will be ordinary, some of it will not. The houses these girls grew up in had servants' bells in every room. The bells were connected by long wires that ran through the walls and into the kitchen, where a panel of small numbered flags would drop down to show which room had rung. The servants moved silently, in soft shoes, on rugs woven specifically to muffle footsteps. The girls grew up understanding that there was always someone in the next room. There was always someone listening. Privacy was a fiction maintained by the consent of the staff, and the staff were paid for their consent. This shaped the women they became. They learned to talk in two registers. There was the surface conversation, the conversation a maid could carry back to a housekeeper, who could carry it back to a butler, who could carry it back to a husband. And there was the conversation that lay underneath, the conversation conducted in glances, in pauses, in the small adjustments of a fan, in the tilt of a head, in the choice of one teacup over another. The women who would later run the secret enterprises of the Gilded Age were trained from childhood in a language of pure subtext. Their entire upbringing was a long apprenticeship in saying things without saying them. And so, when they grew up, when they took their place in the social order, when they became the perfect socialites the newspapers described, they were already fluent in something most of the men around them did not even know was a language. The men spoke to each other in offices, in clubs, in the smoking rooms after dinner, in straight, declarative, business-like sentences. The women spoke to each other in the parlours and the morning rooms in something else entirely, something denser and stranger and far more powerful. The men signed contracts, the women signed nothing. And in the absence of contracts, no one quite knew where the women's authority began or ended. Outside, the cities they lived in were changing. The streets of New York filled with electric lights. The horse cars gave way to streetcars. The skyline began to lift itself story by story into a new and unfamiliar height. There were tenements being built and tenements being torn down. There were dock workers and shop girls and immigrants from every country in Europe. There were saloons on every corner, and behind some of the saloons there were rooms where money changed hands in ways no court would ever examine. The world of the perfect socialite and the world of the dock worker were separated by perhaps a mile, perhaps less, and the wires that ran between them were thinner and more numerous than anyone wanted to admit. In their nurseries, the daughters of the great families slept under quilts stitched by women they would never meet. The lamps were turned low. The nurse moved softly through the room, pulling a curtain straight, checking that the window was latched. The fire in the small grate burned down to embers and gave off the faint, pleasant smell of wood smoke and warm brick. Outside, the city carried on with its long-distant murmur. And somewhere in the dark, a girl who would one day run a quiet empire was learning, without quite knowing she was learning, that the world was a series of rooms, and that the people who knew how to move from one room to the next without being noticed were the people who, in the end, could do almost anything they liked. Consider for a long quiet moment the size of the staffs that ran these households. A great house in the 1880s might employ 20 servants. A truly great house, of the very wealthiest scale, might employ 40 or 50. There was the butler, the head of the male staff, a man of immense dignity and considerable personal authority, who managed the cellar, the silver, the security of the house, and the discipline of the footman. There was the housekeeper, the head of the female staff, a woman often older than the lady of the house herself, who managed the linens, the china, the still room, the laundry, the maids, and the daily provisioning of the household stores. There was the cook who ran the kitchen, who supervised the kitchen maids and the scullery girls, who took her orders directly from the lady at a small morning meeting in the breakfast room each day. There were the parlour maids, the chambermaids, the upstairs maid, the downstairs maid, the lady's maid, the nursery maid, the laundry maid, the still room maid. There were the footman, the underfootman, the boot boy. There was the coachman, the groom, the stable hand. In a country house there was also a gardener and assistant gardeners and gamekeepers and grooms of the stables. There was, in some households, a private chaplain and a private secretary and a music teacher who came twice a week, and a French tutor who came 3 times a week, and a dressmaker who came when called, and a milliner who came for the seasonal hat fittings. This great household, then, was a small commercial enterprise in itself. It had a payroll, it had a hierarchy, it had its own internal politics and feuds and alliances, conducted out of sight of the family but understood thoroughly by the housekeeper and by the lady. The lady, despite the screen of distance maintained between herself and the lower staff, knew, through her conversations with her housekeeper and her lady's maid, almost everything about the lives of the people who served her. She knew which footman was courting which housemaid. She knew which scullery girl had an ailing mother. She knew which member of the kitchen staff drank, and how much, and how the housekeeper was managing it. She did not act on most of this information. She kept it, the way she kept everything, in case it should one day prove useful. This habit of keeping was perhaps the deepest training of all. The girls grew up in households where information was constantly accumulating, in books and ledgers and household calendars and visitors' books, and the heads of housekeepers and ladies' maids, and they grew up understanding that information was a resource, that it had value, that it could be saved against future need. They did not consciously think this. They simply lived inside it, the way fish live inside water without thinking about water. The seasons of these households were as fixed as the seasons of the year. There was the winter season in town, which began in November and ran through the early spring, with its operas and dinners and balls and small dancing parties. There was Lent, a quieter time in which the more boisterous entertainments paused, and the household turned often to charity work and quieter visits. There was the spring, the time of small tea parties in town gardens just coming into bloom. There was the summer, in which the great families decamped to the seaside or to the mountains, and the great townhouses were closed up under dust sheets, and the staff was reduced to a skeleton crew, and the ladies' life became briefly more outdoor, more informal, more concerned with sailing and tennis and long lunches under awnings on terraces overlooking the sea. There was the autumn, the return to town, the reopening of the houses, the unpacking of the dust-sheeted parlours, the slow ramp-up to the next winter season. Each transition involved an extraordinary amount of work. The closing of a townhouse in late spring required weeks of preparation. The carpets were taken up and rolled in lavender, against moths. The chandeliers were sheeted. The portraits were covered with muslin. The silver was packed into baize-lined chests. The good china was stored. The kitchen was emptied. The staff that travelled to the country was packed up, and the staff that remained behind was given its summer instructions. The lady, in the last week before departure, ran an operation of considerable logistical complexity, often without seeming to do anything at all, because the housekeeper and the butler did the visible work, and the lady simply, in her morning room, made the few quiet decisions that determined how the work was to be done. These same skills, the planning, the delegation, the silent oversight, the keeping of mental ledgers across multiple simultaneous projects, were of course exactly the skills required to run a parallel enterprise of any kind. The girls who watched their mothers manage these seasonal transitions were, again without quite knowing it, watching a masterclass in the management of complex operations. By the time they were old enough to do it themselves, they had absorbed the entire art. They could run a household or several households in their sleep. They had energy left over. The energy in some women found its way into other channels. The lullabies these girls were sung at night were old ones. There was a lullaby about a cradle in a treetop. There was a lullaby about counting sheep crossing a stile. There was a lullaby in French, in some households, about a small boat going down a slow river to the sea. There was a lullaby in German, in others, about angels watching over a child's bed. The nurse who sang these lullabies usually had a particular voice, low and a little husky. The voice of a woman who had sung many children to sleep and had learned that the song itself mattered less than the patience of the singing. The girl in her bed listened. The girl drifted. The girl, in her last minutes of consciousness before sleep, sometimes asked her nurse a question. "What is that smell?" the girl might ask. The nurse, smoothing the quilt, would answer in a whisper. "That is the smell of the bread the cook is starting for tomorrow morning. The yeast has just been added. By the time you wake up, the bread will be in the oven, and the smell will be different." The girl, satisfied, would close her eyes. The nurse would sit beside the bed for a few more minutes, until the breathing evened out, and then would rise quietly and go. This is how they slept. This is how their nights ended in the years before the hard work began. The world was being kept around them. The fortunes were being made and the empires were being built, and the violence of all of that was somewhere far away, in the offices and the boardrooms and the stockyards and the mines and the railroad construction camps. And none of it touched the upper rooms of these houses, where the children slept under their quilts, and the small fires burned down in their grates, and the long line of the city's lights, far off in the distance, slowly winked out one by one as the night deepened. The making of a perfect socialite did not end in the nursery. It continued through girlhood, through adolescence, through what was called, with strange seriousness, a young woman's coming out. There were rituals around all of it, rituals as old and elaborate as anything in any older civilization, though Americans liked to pretend they had invented them new. Tonight we move into those rituals. We move slowly. We light the lamps in the long upstairs hallway. We open the door of the schoolroom where the older girls of the household are bent over their lessons, and we look at what they were taught and at what they learned that no one had quite meant to teach them. The schoolroom in a great American house of the 1880s or 1890s was usually on the upper floor near the nursery, looking out over a garden or a street. It had a pianoforte, a globe on a wooden stand, a long table covered in green cloth, and a wall of shelves stocked with the books considered suitable for young ladies. There were French grammars and German readers, and small leather volumes of poetry, and books on natural history filled with engravings of birds. There were no novels of the kind men read, or if there were, they were kept in another room. There were no political tracts. There were no books on economics or on the law. The library of the young lady was carefully pruned, the way a gardener prunes a hedge, to keep the shape regular and the growth in approved directions. The lessons themselves were a curious blend. There was reading, of course, and writing. There was arithmetic, but only enough arithmetic to keep household accounts, not enough to be considered unfeminine. There were languages, especially French, because French was the language of cultivated society, and because half the household menus were in French, and because the dressmakers in Paris wrote their letters in French, and because so many of the books a polite woman was expected to know were in French. There was music, there was drawing, there was, in some households, painting in watercolour, and in some households, even painting in oils, though oils were considered slightly bohemian and best confined to landscapes. There was elocution, the art of speaking aloud beautifully, and recitation, the art of holding a poem in the mouth and giving it back to a room. And there was deportment. Deportment is the word that explains almost everything about how these women were trained. It meant the carriage of the body, the angle of the head, the placement of the hands, the rhythm of the walk. It meant the precise depth of a curtsy. It meant the difference between sitting and being seated, the difference between standing and being placed. It was an entire physical grammar, taught by old French women who had trained the daughters of the Bonaparte, or by retired actresses from the Comédie Française, or by sharp-eyed English women who had once been governesses in the houses of dukes. The girls were drilled in deportment until it became the way they breathed. There is a particular thing that happens to a person who's been drilled in deportment for years. She becomes very, very still, not stiff. Stillness is not stiffness. Stillness is the controlled absence of unnecessary motion. A woman trained in true deportment can sit in a room and her hands will not fidget. Her face will not betray her thoughts. Her eyes will not dart. She becomes, in a sense, unreadable. And unreadability, in a society obsessed with reading every gesture, is power. The girls were also trained, though no one called it training in observation. They learned by watching their mothers and aunts manage drawing rooms full of guests. They watched how a hostess could direct the conversation away from a topic with a small adjustment of her body. They watched how a hostess could lift the mood of a room by introducing two people who had never met. They watched how the angle of a hostess's chair could change the entire shape of a parlour, drawing some guests in and pushing others to the edges. By the time a girl was 18, she had spent thousands of hours studying the social architecture of rooms, and she could read a room the way an experienced sailor reads weather. Then came the coming out. A young woman's coming out was a kind of public exhibition, a formal announcement to the world that she was now of marriageable age and available to be considered. The forms of the coming out varied from city to city and from decade to decade. In New York, it might be a dinner followed by a ball. In Boston, it might be a tea, a quieter affair, more restrained, more old money. In Newport in the summer, it might be a garden party with hundreds of guests under striped awnings. In Charleston or in New Orleans, the rituals had their own particular flavours, drawn from older Southern traditions. In Chicago or in San Francisco, the new money cities, the parties were larger and louder, and the dresses were more elaborate and the champagne flowed faster. But everywhere, the underlying structure was the same. A girl was presented, a girl was inspected. A girl was, in a polite and unspoken way, priced. The dresses for these occasions were extraordinary. White, almost always white, because white was the colour of new beginnings and unblemished worth. Layers of silk, hand-stitched lace, often imported from Belgium or from Ireland. Pearl trim. Tiny seed pearls sewn one by one along a hem. The dressmaker was usually consulted weeks or months in advance. There were fittings. There were adjustments. There were quiet, urgent conversations about the precise placement of a sash. The girl stood very still during all of it, her arms held out a little from her sides, while women on their knees pinned and tucked and murmured. She was being made into an object, in the gentlest possible way, and she knew it. The good ones, the future perfect socialites, did not resent this. They studied it. They understood that the dress was a costume for a role, and that the role was the beginning of something that might, with care, with patience, with cleverness, become a kind of authority. They watched their mothers, who had once stood for the same fittings, and they saw what their mothers had become. Not all of those mothers had become docile wives. Some had become something else. After the coming out, the marriage market opened. This is the language people did not use, but it is the most accurate language. There was a market. The young women were the considered goods, though that phrase is unkind to them, and they were, of course, also human beings with hopes and feelings and inner lives. But socially, structurally, economically, they were assets in motion, and the matrons of the great families were the brokers, and the brokering happened over teacups and at dinner tables and on long carriage drives along the seafront in Newport. A young man of the right family would call, he would leave a card, the girl's mother would either return the card or not. If the card was returned, the young man would call again. There would be a dance at someone's house, there would be a formal dinner, there would be eventually a quiet conversation between fathers, in a study with the door closed, and the door would open and the engagement would be announced. The marriages that resulted were sometimes happy and sometimes not. They were always, at their root, transactions. Property was settled, allowances were arranged, houses were given as wedding gifts. The bride brought what she brought, which was usually social standing, sometimes money, always the labour of running a household and producing children. The groom brought what he brought, which was usually money, sometimes social standing, always the public name under which the household would be conducted. And then the wife began her real work. A married society woman was the chief executive of a small empire. The empire was the household. The household was an enterprise of considerable complexity. There was a cook, a housekeeper, a butler, footman, parlour-maids, ladies' maids, a coachman, a stable hand, sometimes a private secretary, sometimes a steward, sometimes a chaplain. There were multiple residences often. A house in town, a cottage in Newport, a camp in the Adirondacks, a villa abroad. Each of these had its own staff. Each had its own accounts. Each had to be opened and closed at the right moments of the year. The wife managed all of it. She also managed the social calendar, which was its own enterprise. She decided which invitations to accept. She decided which to decline. She decided which to leave unanswered, which was the most powerful move of all, because to leave an invitation unanswered was to refuse to acknowledge that the inviter even existed at the level necessary for refusal. She kept lists, she kept ledgers, she kept careful, private records of who had been to her house, and who had not, and of who had invited her to theirs, and of who had not, and of who owed whom which kind of social debt. These ledgers were a kind of private currency. The wife who kept the best ledgers had the most power. She knew exactly who was rising and exactly who was falling. She knew which marriages were strong and which were strained. She knew which fortunes were quietly hemorrhaging and which were quietly growing. She knew because she had been listening for years in drawing rooms and at dinner tables, while the men were talking loudly in the next room and the women were talking softly in this one. The men did not always understand how much information was passing through the parlours. They thought the parlours were where the women talked about hats. The women allowed the men to think this. It was useful for the men to think this. The men went off to their offices and their boards and their clubs, and they made their decisions on the basis of what other men told them, and they came home in the evening and ate dinner at tables their wives had arranged, and they did not always notice that their wives knew, very precisely, things they did not yet know themselves. Some of those wives used what they knew for ordinary social advancement. They climbed. They placed their daughters well. They arranged matches. They built their husbands' careers in ways their husbands sometimes recognized and sometimes did not. This was the ordinary path of the perfect socialite, and there were thousands of women who walked it. But some of those wives, a smaller number, used what they knew differently. They began to notice that the same skills which made one a great hostess made one, in another light, an excellent organizer of more shadowy things, the ability to keep secrets, the ability to read a room, the ability to direct money quietly through trusted hands, the ability to know which men could be relied on and which could not, the ability to build a network across cities, across oceans, across the thin and porous border between what was respectable and what was not. And so we begin, slowly, to come to the heart of our story. Not with one woman, but with the conditions that made certain women possible. Not with crime, but with the soft and entirely respectable training that taught some of these women, almost by accident, that they were uniquely suited to the management of enterprises that no man would ever suspect them of running. Consider also the role of the dressmaker in the life of a woman of this class. The dressmaker was usually a woman herself, often a French woman or an English woman of considerable training, who had set up a small establishment in the city and who served a select group of clients. She came to the house. She did not require the lady to come to her. She arrived with her assistant, who carried the materials in long flat boxes. The fittings took place in the lady's bedroom or in her boudoir. The lady stood. The dressmaker, with pins held delicately between her lips, adjusted and tucked and marked. The lady's maid stood by, ready to hand a particular ribbon, a particular sample of trim. The conversation during these fittings was its own small art form. The dressmaker had clients in many houses. She knew, accordingly, much about what was happening in the city. The lady, while standing very still and being measured, could ask carefully framed questions and could receive carefully framed answers, and a great deal of social intelligence could be exchanged in the course of an afternoon's fitting that would leave no trace in any letter or any account book. The dressmaker was, in some sense, an unofficial member of the household network. The lady trusted her. The lady paid her promptly. The lady recommended her to other ladies. In return, the dressmaker carried information back and forth among her clients, in small, careful doses, never overstepping, never gossiping in any way that could be called gossip, but always somehow knowing, when argued, the answer to whatever quiet question the lady wished to put. This was an old relationship, going back centuries in European households, and it had been transplanted with all its subtleties intact into the great American houses of the late 19th century. Similar relationships existed with the milliner, the corset maker, the glover, the shoemaker. Each of these specialists had access to certain houses, certain bodies, certain rooms. Each of them, over years, accumulated a particular kind of knowledge. Most of them used this knowledge only for ordinary professional purposes. The better fitting of a hat, the more flattering arrangement of a hem. Some of them, the cleverest ones, found that their knowledge was valuable in other ways, and developed quiet sidelines of their own, sometimes in association with one or another of their lady clients. There was also the role of the family doctor. The The doctor was a man, almost always of considerable standing. He had attended the ladies' children at their births. He had treated the family's illnesses and accidents for decades. He came to the house when called, in any season, at any hour. He was paid, like the lawyer, on a kind of retainer rather than on a strict fee-for-service basis. He had, in many households, the same kind of confidential access that the lawyer had, though for different purposes. The doctor knew, of course, the medical history of every member of the family. He knew which children had been weak in infancy. He knew which adults suffered from chronic complaints they did not discuss in society. He knew, in some cases, of pregnancies that had been ended quietly, of illnesses that were of a more delicate kind, of the use of certain medicines that were prescribed, in those days, with rather more freedom than would later become customary. The lady trusted him absolutely. He in turn treated her confidences as inviolable. This circle of trusted professionals, the lawyer, the doctor, the dressmaker, the housekeeper, the lady's maid, the trusted cook, the older butler who had been with the family for 30 years, formed the inner cabinet of the lady's working life. She did not call them that. She did not think of them collectively at all. But they were, in functional terms, the small group of people through whom her authority flowed, and on whose discretion the conduct of her affairs entirely depended. She paid them well. She remembered their birthdays. She sent flowers when their relatives were ill. She attended their funerals when they died. She did not patronize them in the modern sense. She maintained, through long practice, the kind of careful warmth that secured permanent loyalty, without ever crossing the line into a familiarity that might erode the chain of authority. The other young women a girl observed growing up included a particular figure who would have been seen often in the household, the visiting aunt. There was almost always one aunt, on either the mother's or the father's side, who never married, who lived alone in a small apartment in the city or with a brother in some country house, and who appeared at family gatherings as a slightly mysterious figure with strong opinions and many friends, and a way of moving through rooms that suggested she did not require anyone's permission. The unmarried aunt, in a great many of these families, was a person of considerable interest to the observant niece. The aunt seemed, to the niece, to live differently. The aunt had her own income often, from a trust set up by her father at her coming of age. The aunt travelled. The aunt read books that were not approved for the niece's reading. The aunt occasionally said things at the dinner table that made the niece's mother frown. The aunt sometimes, when she came to visit and stayed a few weeks, took the niece out for long walks, or for tea at fashionable cafes, or for visits to museums and exhibitions. During these excursions, the aunt sometimes spoke to the niece more frankly than the niece had ever been spoken to. The aunt explained, without quite explaining, that the world was somewhat larger and somewhat stranger than the niece had been told, and that the niece would, in due course, find this out for herself, and that there were ways of being a woman in this world that the niece had not yet been shown. The niece, listening, did not always understand, but she remembered, and in some cases, decades later, when the niece had become a wife and a mother and the manager of a quiet enterprise of her own, she remembered her aunt's particular way of glancing across a restaurant table and lifting a teaspoon at a particular angle to make a particular point, and she understood that her education, in those years, had been more thorough than she had at the time realized. Outside the schoolroom window, the long American afternoon turned slowly to dusk. The lamps were lit. The fire was banked. The girl closed her book of French verbs and put it away. Tomorrow there would be more lessons. The day after, more. And in 5 or 10 or 15 years there would be a drawing room of her own, and a husband and a household, and a life that to outside eyes would look exactly like every other life on her street, and would not be, not entirely, not at all. We are still in the upper world, the world of polished floors and silver tea services. We have not yet stepped down into the cellars where the second life was kept. We will get there, slowly. There is no need to hurry. Tonight we walk through the front rooms first, the rooms the visitors saw, and we look at the language those rooms spoke, because once you understand the language, you will see how easy it was for some women to use it as a cover. Begin with gloves. A society woman of the late 19th century owned dozens of pairs of gloves. There were morning gloves of pale chamois leather, soft as a peach skin. There were afternoon gloves of darker leather, more formal. There were evening gloves of long white kid that reached above the elbow and were buttoned along the inner arm with tiny pearl buttons that took a maid a quarter of an hour to fasten. There were riding gloves of stout brown leather, lined with silk, There were funeral gloves of black silk so fine it caught the light like water. There were gloves for opera, gloves for the theatre, gloves for paying calls, gloves for receiving them, gloves for weddings, gloves for christenings, gloves for the simple act of stepping out the front door for a turn around the square. Each pair of gloves carried meaning. A woman who appeared at an afternoon call in evening gloves would have signalled either ignorance or affront, depending on her standing. A woman who removed only one glove during a visit signalled something different from a woman who removed both. The way a glove was held, the way it was placed on a side table, the way it was drawn back on at the end of a visit, all of these were small gestures within a vast unwritten grammar. A clever woman could communicate astonishing amounts of information through gloves alone. An almost imperceptible delay in removing them might tell a hostess that the visit would be brief. The placement of them on the chair beside the visitor, rather than on the side table, indicated something about the relationship between visitor and hostess. The sliding of a single glove off the right hand only, while leaving the left gloved, sometimes indicated that the visitor wished to write a private note before leaving, or that she wished to be presented with something to read, or that she expected the conversation to move toward business. None of this was written down anywhere. All of it was understood. Calling cards spoke their own language. A card was a small rectangle of fine paper, usually engraved rather than printed. The engraving alone was a status statement. Engraved cards were more expensive than printed ones, and the difference was visible at a glance to anyone who handled them. The card carried the name in the centre, and sometimes an address in one corner. There were cards for women, cards for men, cards for married couples, cards for daughters who had not yet come out, cards for daughters who had. The cards were carried in small silver cases. The cases themselves could be plain or elaborate. When a woman called at another woman's house, she gave her card to the footman who answered the door. If the lady of the house was at home and willing to receive, the footman conducted the visitor to the parlour. If the lady was not at home, or was at home but not receiving, the visitor left her card on the silver tray in the entrance hall, sometimes with a corner turned down. A turned corner meant the visitor had come in person rather than sending a servant with the card. This was a courtesy, a small thing, but a noticed one. There were further refinements. A card with the upper left corner turned signified a personal call. A card with the upper right corner turned signified felicitations, a congratulation on a marriage or a birth. A card with the lower left corner turned signified condolence. A card with the lower right corner turned signified a leave-taking, that the visitor was about to leave town for an extended period. These small signals saved enormous amounts of time and protected everyone from awkward conversations. A widow could be acknowledged without any words being exchanged. A new mother could be congratulated without anyone needing to enter the sick room. A departure could be marked without a long, sentimental scene. For our purposes, the most interesting fact about all of this was that it created an enormous amount of legitimate, untraceable, woman-to-woman communication. A footman might carry 40 cards in a day from one house to another. The cards were exchanged, examined, sometimes preserved in card cases on parlour mantels as a kind of social proof of who had visited recently. They were entirely unsuspicious. They were, in fact, the most ordinary item of a woman's day. A clever organiser of secrets could use this system in ways that no postal inspector, and no detective and no curious husband would ever notice. A particular pattern of card exchange between two households could mean a meeting was to be held. A particular order of corner turns could indicate a date or an hour. The pile of cards on a mantelpiece looked, to any visitor, like a record of social standing. To the woman who had arranged them, they could be something else, entirely. They could be a calendar. They could be a code book. They could be, with the right system, an entire correspondence conducted under the cover of perfect propriety. Then there were the flowers. Flowers in the Gilded Age were not decorative. They were a language, the so-called language of flowers, codified in small bound dictionaries that any young woman could buy at any bookseller. A red rose meant love. A white rose meant innocence. A yellow rose meant friendship, or in some dictionaries, infidelity. A violet meant modesty. A camellia meant admiration. An iris meant a message. A geranium meant folly. A marigold meant grief. A lily of the valley meant the return of happiness. A sprig of rosemary meant remembrance. Bouquets were assembled with these meanings in mind. A young man courting a girl might send a bouquet of mixed flowers whose combined meaning told a small story. The girl, holding the bouquet, would consult her dictionary in private, and would understand. The girl's mother might also consult the dictionary, and would also understand, and might intervene if the meaning was unsuitable. There were arguments conducted entirely through bouquets. There were apologies. There were proposals and rejections. There were love affairs that began and ended without a single explicit word ever being written down. For the women who would later become organisers of more shadowy enterprises, the language of flowers was another tool ready to hand. A standing order with a particular florist could be set up to deliver on certain days certain combinations of flowers to certain houses. The combinations themselves carried meaning. The flowers were, to any outside observer, simply the floral arrangements of a fashionable hostess. Inside the household, to the maid who placed them on the hall table, to the lady who passed them and noted them and adjusted them ever so slightly, they could be a complete instruction set. Fans had their own language too, especially in the hot summers of Newport and Saratoga. A fan held open before the face indicated one thing. A fan closed and tapped against the cheek indicated another. A fan trailed slowly across the eyes meant something between sorrow and reluctance. A fan handled with the right hand meant one thing, with the left another. None of this was published in any official manual, but every young woman picked it up by watching, and once she'd picked it up, she could conduct entire conversations across a crowded ballroom without ever speaking. The men, again, did not entirely realize how much was being said. The men noticed pretty fans and pretty hands. They did not always notice that the pretty hand was, in fact, signalling the next move in something quite specific. Now layer on top of all of this the ordinary correspondence of a society woman, the notes she wrote and received every day, the letters that came in the morning post and the afternoon post and were answered before dinner. A woman of any standing wrote dozens of letters a week. Letters of thanks, letters of invitation, letters of refusal, letters of condolence, letters to relatives in other cities, letters to friends abroad, letters to dressmakers, letters to florists, letters to charities. The volume was tremendous. The letters were written at small writing desks in morning rooms, on heavy cream paper engraved with monograms, with steel-nibbed pens that made a faint scratching sound in the quiet of an early hour. All of this correspondence flowed through the household and out into the city and across the country. None of it was checked by anyone. There were no government readers. There were no employer inspectors. A woman could write a letter saying anything she liked, and so long as the surface of the letter was unobjectionable, the letter would be sent and would arrive and would be read and would be answered, and no one would think anything of it. When you put all of this together, when you think about a woman in a great household with command of gloves, calling cards, flowers, fans, and a private mountain of daily correspondence, you begin to see the scale of the communication system she controlled. It was a network as dense as anything the men were running through their offices and their telegraphs. It was, in some ways, denser. It was certainly less examined, and it was hers. This is the soft architecture inside which our second story lived. The women who ran what we will, for tonight's purposes, call their other enterprises, did not have to invent new tools. They simply used the tools they had been handed in girlhood. The tools were already perfect. The tools were already invisible to anyone who was not also using them. The tools had been designed, over centuries, for the management of polite life, and polite life turned out to be the most useful possible disguise for the management of impolite things. Outside the parlour windows, the late afternoon light slanted long across the floor. The maid came in with a small tray and removed the empty teacups. The lady of the house tucked a pile of cards into a leather portfolio and slid the portfolio into a drawer of her writing desk. She turned the small key in the lock. She put the key on a thin gold chain that lived under her collar. She rose, smoothed her skirt, and went to dress for dinner. The room behind her was quiet. The drawer was closed. The cards inside it spoke in their silent language to anyone who could read them. The footman, returning to remove the tray, glanced at the desk and saw nothing but a desk. The cards were already gone. The lady was already gone. The afternoon was already gone. The next thing on the schedule was dinner, and the dinner had been planned a week ago in another room, with another set of cards, and was about to unfold exactly as planned. There is more to say about the medium of paper itself. The paper of a fashionable correspondence was not a casual thing. It came from particular makers, in particular weights, in particular shades of cream or pale blue, or, for mourning, the heavy black-bordered stock that was used for letters in the year following a death. Each lady chose her own paper carefully. The paper said something about her. Heavier paper said one thing, lighter paper said another. The watermark, when held to the light, sometimes told a story about the maker and about the lady's choice. There were small distinctions, almost imperceptible, that connoisseurs could read. To someone trained in the field, a stack of unfamiliar letters could be sorted by writer, almost without reading the signatures, simply by the weight and texture and shade of the paper, by the fragrance, by the placement of the address. The fragrance, by the way, was its own communication. Many ladies used a particular sachet in the drawer where their writing paper was kept, so that letters arrived with a faint scent attached. The scents varied. There was lavender, the most common. There was a particular blend of rose and orris that some ladies preferred. There was, occasionally, a heavier scent of musk or amber, which was considered rather forward, but which a few older women, secure enough in their position not to care, used with a kind of confident defiance. The recipient of a letter, lifting the envelope from the silver tray on the hall console, would know, sometimes before reading the address, who had written it, by the perfume that drifted up from the paper. These small signatures of identity were used by some women in additional ways. A lady who wished to indicate that a particular letter contained more than its surface text might use a different paper, or a different scent, or a different sealing wax than her usual practice. The recipient noticing the change would know to read the letter with extra care. Nothing in the letter itself would alert a casual reader. The signal lay entirely in the materials, in the choices a casual reader would not even register. The communication was complete before the envelope was opened. The contents of the letter could then be entirely innocuous, and indeed often were, because the work had already been done by the choice of paper alone. There was also the matter of timing. A letter sent at a particular hour by a particular post might mean something different from the same letter sent at a different hour. The afternoon post was different from the morning post. A letter sent on a Thursday meant something different from one sent on a Friday. A letter sent the day after a particular event meant something different from one sent the day after that. Patterns of timing, observed over years, became their own informal language. A particular correspondent who sent letters always on Tuesday mornings would be noticed if, one week, she sent a letter on Wednesday afternoon. The change of timing was itself a piece of information. The telephone, when it arrived, was treated with a certain caution by the older women in our story. The telephone was loud. The telephone was overheard. The telephone connected to a switchboard operated by strangers. The telephone passed through the hands of operators who could, in principle, listen to whatever was said. The older ladies preferred letters and cards, and the patient, slow architecture they had built up over decades. The younger ladies, raised with the new instrument, used it more freely. Eventually the telephone became a tool that could itself be used, with care, in the maintenance of certain networks. But for the women whose careers had taken shape before its arrival, the telephone was always slightly suspect, and the older methods, the methods of paper and envelope and seal, remained the more trusted ones. There was wisdom in the older methods. They had been used for centuries. They were known to work. Consider also the role of the maid in the conduct of correspondence. A lady's maid often had a hand, literal as well as figurative, in her mistress's letter-writing. She brought the morning post to the bedroom on a small tray, fanned out so that the lady could see all the envelopes at once and choose which to open first. She refilled the inkwell. She trimmed the steel pens. She blotted the finished letters. She sealed them, with the lady's permission, and addressed them in her own neat hand if the lady was tired. She took them down to the front hall to be collected by the footman. She knew accordingly who the lady wrote to and who wrote to the lady. She knew the names, she knew the frequency. She knew which correspondents were old friends and which were newer relationships. A lady's maid who had been with her mistress for many years held, in this respect, an enormous archive of knowledge in her head. She did not, in the great majority of cases, ever speak of any of it. Her position depended on her not speaking. Her livelihood, her old age, her own quiet ambitions all rested on the trust her mistress placed in her, and that trust would be destroyed by any indiscretion. She kept what she knew. She took it, eventually, to her own grave. The lady's maid is one of the great unsung figures of the era, present in every house, knowing almost everything, saying almost nothing, dying with an immense personal archive sealed inside her like a closed book. The same was true, to a slightly lesser extent, of the housekeeper. She did not have access to the actual letters in the same way as the lady's maid. But she saw the household accounts. She saw the kitchen orders, the wine orders, the orders to the wine merchant for special dinners that would mark in some cases the conclusion of negotiations no one outside the family knew about. She saw the unusual deliveries, the boxes that arrived and were taken to the ladies' morning room rather than to the household stores. She knew which guests had stayed, and for how long, and in what rooms, and what their preferences had been. She kept her own ledgers, the household ledgers, and the household ledgers, read with a knowing eye, sometimes told a story rather different from the official one. She, like the lady's maid, kept what she knew. The discipline of these older female servants was extraordinary, and it was, in its way, one of the foundations on which the secret half of the household rested. Sleep is creeping in now, perhaps. The room around you is quiet. The world we're walking through is far away, and the people in it have been gone for 100 years, and the small rituals they followed seem strange and beautiful and slightly absurd from this distance. You do not need to remember any of it. You do not need to keep track of the meanings of the gloves. The story will keep moving without you, the way a quiet river keeps moving even when no one is watching the surface. Let yourself drift along the bank. We have many more rooms to enter, and we will enter them slowly. Let us pick a particular woman now, not a real one, a composite, a kind of imagined portrait drawn from the lives of many. We will call her Mrs. Hollister. She lived on a quiet, leafy street in a great American city in the 1890s. Her husband owned a shipping concern. Her house had a green awning over the front door and a brass plate beside it engraved with the family name. There was a row of tall windows on the second floor, each hung with cream silk curtains tied back with thick gold cord. From the street, the house looked like every other house on the block, except perhaps a little better kept. The steps a little more often scrubbed, the brass a little brighter. Mrs. Hollister was not famous. Her name appeared in the newspapers perhaps 2 or 3 times a year, in connection with charity benefits and the occasional formal dinner. She was not known for great beauty, though she had a steady, agreeable face and a low, calm voice. She was not known for great wealth, though her household was comfortable. She was, by every external measure, an ordinary upper-middle-class woman of her time, the kind of woman whose obituary, when it eventually came, would be a column or 2 on an inside page. Inside the house, however, things were a little different. The morning began at 6. The cook was already in the kitchen by then, lighting the great cast-iron range, sorting the day's deliveries from the back gate. The bread was pulled hot from the oven and wrapped in clean linen. The coffee was ground fresh in a small wooden mill. The smell of the kitchen rose through the back stairs and filled the lower hallways with a warm, dense fragrance of bread and ground coffee and bacon and the faint, sweet smell of a milk delivery just brought in from the porch. Mrs. Hollister rose at 6:30. Her bedroom faced east, and the curtains, when her maid drew them back, admitted a flat band of pale grey light that gradually turned pink and then gold as the sun climbed above the rooftops. She was dressed by 7:30 in a soft morning gown of pale lavender wool. Her hair was already arranged, pinned high, every wisp in place by the practised fingers of a maid who had been with her for 19 years. Breakfast was served at 8, in a small breakfast room overlooking the back garden. There was coffee and toast and a single soft-boiled egg in a porcelain cup. The morning newspapers were laid out on the sideboard, ironed flat by the butler so the print would not smudge on her hands. She read through them slowly, marking small items with a pencil. The pencil was kept on a green leather blotter beside her plate. What she was reading for, the maids and the butler did not know. They assumed she was reading for the social columns, as so many women of her station did. She did read the social columns, and she did mark them. But she also read the financial columns, and the shipping news, and the columns on courts and on accidents and on the price of certain commodities. She marked these too, with a small, careful tick, and at the end of breakfast she folded the papers and took them with her to her morning room. The morning room was the heart of the house. It was a small, square room on the second floor with a single south-facing window. It had a writing desk of polished cherry wood, a comfortable chair, a low chaise longue, a small bookcase, and a coal grate that burned steadily through the winter months. The walls were papered in a pale yellow striped pattern that gave the room a constant impression of mild sunshine, even on a grey morning. A portrait hung above the fireplace. The portrait showed a man, Mrs. Hollister's late father, in a dark suit and a high collar, with the steady, measuring eyes of a person who had spent his life watching cargo move on and off ships. She closed the door of the morning room behind her. The maid did not enter the morning room without being called. This was an old rule of the house, and the staff respected it absolutely. Inside, Mrs. Hollister sat at her desk. She unfolded the papers. She made notes in a small leather book she kept in the locked top drawer. The notes she made would, to a casual reader, have looked like nothing at all. They were brief, they were cryptic, a name and a date, a street and a number, a column of small figures in pencil, a single word underlined twice. The notes were the working memory of an enterprise that did not appear on any tax form, that did not appear on any business directory, that had no office and no letterhead, but that conducted, on a quiet, steady, increasing scale, a particular kind of business. The business, in our composite, was the discreet movement of goods through the docks her husband's company controlled. The goods themselves are not the point of our story tonight. They might have been silks brought in without payment of duty. They might have been spirits in unlabelled barrels. They might have been objects of greater value still, brought from the East and unloaded at hours when no inspector happened to be on duty. The point is that the system through which these goods moved was not, in fact, run by her husband, who did not know of it. It was run by her. She did not call it a criminal enterprise. She did not call it anything. She thought of it, in her own mind, as the management of certain irregular accounts. The accounts had begun small. They had been started, in fact, by her father, who had passed certain knowledge to her in long evening conversations in this same morning room when she was 15 years old, and her father was beginning to suspect that he might not live as long as he had planned. He had no son. He had her. He had decided, with the cool practical clarity that had built his fortune in the first place, that she would do. Her father had taught her the names of the men at the docks who could be relied on. He had taught her the names of the men in the customs house who could be reasoned with. He had taught her how to keep a second set of books. He had taught her how to encode the second set so that even if it were found, it would look, at first reading, like a book of household expenses. He had taught her that the most important thing was never, ever, to enrich oneself faster than was credible. The household must always look exactly like a household. The dresses must be no finer than the dresses of one's neighbours. The carriage must be no more elegant. The dinner table must be no more lavish. Excess was the enemy. Excess attracted attention. Attention attracted questions. Questions attracted ruin. She had absorbed these lessons completely. She had grown up. She had married by careful design, the kind of man who would inherit a respectable shipping firm and would never look too closely at the operations of his own back office. She had let him have the public name. She had taken the private operation. She had run it by the time of our story for almost 20 years. Her morning continued. She wrote a letter to a man in another city. The letter was short. It thanked him for a recent gift of a basket of pears. It mentioned that the pears had been particularly fine. It enclosed a small card with the family monogram. The man, when he received the letter, would understand that the basket of pears referred to a particular shipment, and that the description of the pears as particularly fine was the agreed signal that the shipment had been received and accounted for, and that he was therefore to release the next shipment as planned. The letter, if intercepted by anyone, would have read like exactly what it pretended to be, a polite thank you note from a polite woman in a polite household. She wrote 4 more letters of similar character. She sealed each with wax, using a small brass seal kept in her desk. The seal bore an innocuous design, a sprig of laurel. It was the family seal, registered to no one suspicious. The letters went into a leather portfolio. At 10 she rang for the footman. She gave him the portfolio. He was to take the letters to the post. He bowed, took them, and went. He had been doing this for years. He had no idea what was in the letters. He took them every morning. They were always sealed. He took them to the post office, and he posted them, and he came back, and he was paid his wages every Friday, and he was content. After the post she had visitors, 2 of them by appointment. The first was Mrs. Latimer, an old friend, who came at 10:30 and stayed until 11. They drank tea. They discussed a benefit for a hospital. They discussed the dress Mrs. Latimer's daughter would wear at her coming out next month. They discussed a recent illness of Mrs. Latimer's mother. The conversation, on the surface, was entirely as it appeared. Underneath, in the small adjustments of the cup and the precise placement of the spoon, and the brief lifting of an eyebrow at a particular moment, certain other information was exchanged. Mrs. Latimer left at 11. Both women smiled warmly at the parting. Both women understood exactly what had been agreed. The second visitor was a Miss Crane, a young woman who was officially the secretary of a small charitable society. Miss Crane had come, ostensibly, to discuss a forthcoming meeting of the society's board. They did discuss the meeting. They also discussed the recent movements of certain small sums of money through certain small accounts, and Miss Crane, who was extraordinarily good at arithmetic and who came from a family that had fallen on hard times, in a manner that did not bear close examination, made notes in a small notebook of her own. She left at noon. The morning's business was concluded. Mrs. Hollister rang for lunch. This is what we are tracing tonight, this quiet morning in this quiet house. This is what the business of the perfect socialite as criminal organizer actually looked like. It did not look like a smoky room full of men in shirt sleeves. It did not look like a roar of activity. It looked like a calm, well-papered morning room, and a slim leather portfolio, and a woman in a pale lavender gown writing very ordinary-seeming notes in a very neat hand, and ringing for a footman to take her letters to the post, and receiving callers with whom she discussed hospitals and dresses, and the precise composition of the next benefit ball. The genius of it, if we may use that word for a moment, was the ordinariness. It looked exactly like every other morning in every other house on the block. The other houses on the block had their own quiet enterprises, perhaps, or they did not. Most of them did not. Most of the houses on the block contained exactly what they appeared to contain, which was a comfortable household running on ordinary money. Mrs. Hollister's household looked the same to the casual eye, and to the not-so-casual eye, and even for the most part to the trained official eye. The customs inspectors who occasionally visited her husband's offices found nothing irregular. The auditors who occasionally went over the firm's accounts found nothing irregular. There was nothing irregular to be found, because the irregular accounts were not at the firm. They were here, in a leather book, in a locked drawer, in a quiet room with a yellow-striped wallpaper, and a portrait of a long dead man over the fireplace. The portrait, by the way, was watching her, or so she sometimes felt. She had been a girl of 15 when her father had begun her education in these matters. She was now in her early 40s. She had outlived her father by more than 2 decades. He had taught her, and she had become in some real sense his successor. The painted eyes above the fireplace looked down on her every morning, and she looked back, and there was, in those moments, something that was not quite triumph and not quite sorrow, but a kind of long, steady understanding. She took her lunch alone in the breakfast room. A clear soup, a piece of cold chicken, a small salad of watercress, a glass of mineral water. She read another newspaper. She marked another column. After lunch she rested for an hour in her bedroom, lying on a daybed with a light shawl over her knees and a novel open on her lap. The novel, at this point in the day, was real. She did read novels, she enjoyed them. The novels she preferred were detective stories, English ones, set in country houses and quiet villages where dreadful things happened among polite people. She found them entertaining. She also found them informative. She had picked up over the years several useful ideas from novels. She had refined more than one of her own procedures after considering how a fictional detective would have caught a fictional criminal. Fiction was, she thought, an excellent training ground. The fictional detectives were always cleverer than the real ones. If she could construct a system that could, in principle, evade the cleverest fictional detective she had ever read, then the real ones would never come close. So far her reasoning had held. Late in the afternoon she dressed for tea. The dress was a simple wool, navy blue with a small lace collar. She received 3 callers between 4 and 5. They drank tea. They ate small almond cakes the cook had baked that morning. They talked, on the surface, about a forthcoming opera season and about a mutual friend's recent travels in Europe. Underneath, in the practised unwritten grammar of the parlour, they conducted a number of small transactions of considerable financial weight. None of the callers wrote anything down in front of any of the others. None of them needed to. The transactions were memorized as they were conducted and committed that evening to the private books of 3 different households. At 5:30 the callers left. Mrs. Hollister returned to her morning room. She unlocked the desk drawer. She made her own notes. She locked the drawer again. She placed the key on the gold chain under her collar. She rose, smoothed her dress, and went downstairs to greet her husband, who came home from his offices at 6, and to whom she had, in their long marriage, never said a single word about any of the business we have just described. He kissed her cheek. He asked about her day. She said it had been a quiet one. He said his had been long. They went into the dining room together and sat down to dinner. The dinner itself was a small ritual that mattered. The dining room had been laid by the parlour maid in the late afternoon. The cloth was crisp white linen. The silver had been polished that morning. There was a low arrangement of flowers in the centre of the table, never high enough to obstruct conversation across the table, never showy enough to draw attention from the food. The candles in the silver candlesticks had been lit just before they came down. The wine had been decanted an hour before. The cook had prepared a small simple menu, 3 courses, nothing extravagant on a quiet evening when there were no guests. A clear soup, a roast chicken with seasonal vegetables, a small dish of stewed fruit and a thin slice of cake. The food was good but not remarkable, and that was as it should be. Remarkable food was for entertaining. The food they ate themselves, alone together, was meant to be unobtrusive, a kind of nourishment that simply did its work and got out of the way. They talked over the dinner about the small ordinary topics of a long marriage. He told her about a meeting he had attended that afternoon. She told him about a letter she had received from a niece. They discussed a forthcoming wedding to which they had both been invited. They debated briefly whether they should attend or send their regrets. They decided to attend. They moved through the meal slowly with no haste, the candles burning down gently in their holders. Behind their shoulders the parlour maid stood near the sideboard, ready to clear courses, almost invisible by long practice. Neither of them noticed her, because she had been trained for years not to be noticed. After dinner he went to the library, which was his particular room, and lit a small fire there, and settled into his chair with a newspaper and a glass of port. She went to her own sitting room across the hall, which was her particular room, and rang for coffee, and sat with her embroidery on her lap. The needle moved slowly. The fire in the grate burned steadily. Outside, the evening had settled fully into night. The street lamps on the avenue had been lit by a man with a long pole who walked the length of the block at dusk every evening, lighting them one by one. The light from the street lamps reached the windows of her sitting room and made a pale, flickering pattern on the curtains. This is the picture of a quiet evening in a respectable household. There are thousands of such evenings, in thousands of such houses in every American city of the period. To anyone walking past on the avenue, the lighted window with its quiet figure inside is one of the comforting images of the era, the picture of domestic peace, the picture of the well-ordered home. The picture is true. The peace is real. The order is real. What is also true, alongside the peace and the order, is that the woman in the sitting room has, in the course of this single ordinary day, made decisions affecting the movement of considerable sums of money through several states, and has done so without missing a single course of her dinner or a single stitch of her embroidery. The doubleness by this point in our story is so practised that it does not feel doubled to her. It feels like a single life, lived along its appointed grooves, with each part properly located in its proper hour. The morning is for the books and the letters. The midday is for callers. The afternoon is for tea and for the second wave of callers. The evening is for the husband, the dinner, the embroidery. Each compartment is its own time. Each compartment has its own discipline. The whole arrangement taken together is the life she's built. She thinks, sometimes, in the long quiet of her sitting-room evening, about the women in other houses on the avenue. She knows most of them, at least slightly. She has visited some of them. She's had them in her own parlour. She wonders, in passing, what the inner architecture of their houses might be. She knows that some of them, very probably, are running quiet enterprises of their own, of one kind or another, just as she is running hers. She does not, of course, know which ones. They will never tell her. She will never tell them. The system depends on the silence, and the silence is honoured. But she sometimes thinks, with a small inner smile, that the avenue at night, with its rows of lighted windows and its quiet figures inside, is a kind of hidden city. The visible city, the city of streets and shops and offices, is one city. The hidden city, the one that lives in the small parlours and morning rooms behind the curtains, is another city, much larger and stranger and more interesting than the visible one, and the women in the lighted windows are its citizens, and they recognise each other across the avenues by signs no man would ever notice. The clock in the hall struck 9. She set down her embroidery. She rang for her maid. The maid came in with the small lamp ready to escort her upstairs. She rose, said good night to her husband through the open door of his library, and went up the stairs. The maid followed with the lamp. The house behind her settled into its night routine. The fires were banked in the parlours. The doors were locked. The footman did his last rounds. The cook in the kitchen below tidied her workspace and went up to bed. The parlour maid, last to retire, went up the back stairs with a small candle in a brass candlestick, and disappeared into her room under the eaves. In her own bedroom, the lady let her maid undress her. She put on her nightdress and her wrapper. She sat at her dressing table while her maid took down her hair. She looked at herself in the mirror calmly, and saw, in the candlelight, a woman of 43 with steady eyes and a faintly tired mouth. And she thought, as she sometimes thought at this hour, that she had become exactly the woman her father had hoped she would become, and that this was a strange and not entirely happy fact, but also not entirely an unhappy one. She had done what she'd been asked to do. She'd done it well. The doing of it had been her life. The life had been, in many ways, a good life. She did not, in this evening hour, ask whether it had been a true one. She had stopped asking that question some years before. She had decided that the question was too large to be of any practical use, and she'd set it aside, and the setting aside had given her a kind of peace. She went to bed. The maid drew the curtains of the bed. The lamp was put out. The room was very dark. She lay on her side and listened to the small night sounds of the house. Outside, a single late carriage passed in the street. The horses' hooves clopped slowly. Then they were gone, and there was only silence, and the slow ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall, and the deep, settled breathing of a house at peace with itself, and she fell asleep, and the long day ended. This is what it looked like. This is what it always looked like. The picture from outside was of a calm, ordinary, prosperous household, and the calm and the ordinariness and the prosperity were all genuine, in a sense. The household really was calm. It really was prosperous. It really did run with the smooth efficiency of a well-oiled clock. The only thing about it that would have surprised a visitor was the clock itself, the actual mechanism inside the case, the gears and springs and counterweights that no one ever opened the case to see. If you had pressed your hand to the case at certain hours of the day, you might, just possibly, have felt the soft vibration of the works inside. But most people did not press their hands to clocks. They glanced at the face, they read the time, they went on with their day. Mrs. Hollister went on with hers day after day, year after year. The clock kept perfect time. The polished surface gave nothing away. Tonight there is a ball, somewhere in the city, in a great house we have not yet visited. The ball will be the event of the season. The newspapers have written about it for weeks. The orchestra has been engaged. The flowers have been ordered from 3 different florists, who have been working in shifts to assemble the great arrangements. The kitchens have been preparing for days. There will be 300 guests. There will be quite possibly more. This is the kind of evening in which our women moved with the most ease, and in which their work was, paradoxically, most easily accomplished. A great ball was a thicket of attention so dense and so distracted that the smallest things could pass through it unnoticed. The hostess of this particular ball in our composite story is Mrs. Vale. She's an older woman, perhaps in her late 50s. She has white hair piled high in the old French style, and she wears a dress of deep wine-coloured velvet trimmed with very fine antique lace. She stands at the top of a curving marble staircase. As each guest arrives, the butler announces the name in a clear, measured voice that carries across the great hall. Mrs. Vale offers a gloved hand. The guest, descending or ascending depending on the architecture, passes briefly into Mrs. Vale's orbit, exchanges a word or two, and moves on into the throng beyond. She does this for 2 hours, without sitting down, without taking refreshment, without showing any sign of fatigue. The discipline alone is remarkable. The discipline, however, is only the surface. Underneath, she is conducting the equivalent of a long executive meeting. To each guest she nods. To certain guests she offers a particular phrase. The phrase varies. To one she says the season has been kind. To another she says, I am so glad you came. To a third she says, you must find Mr. So-and-so. He's been wanting a word. To a fourth she says nothing at all, only inclines her head and smiles. Each variation, to those guests who know how to read it, contains an instruction, or a reassurance, or a refusal. By the time the receiving line is over, she has, in a sense, conducted a meeting with 30 different parties, and each party has come away with the precise piece of information meant for them, and the rest of the room has noticed nothing. Inside the ballroom the floor is filling. The orchestra is playing softly, an old waltz being held in reserve until the dancing properly begins. The chandeliers above are lit with hundreds of candles. The walls are mirrored. The reflections multiply the lights, and the lights multiply the people, and the whole room hums with the quiet roar of a polite crowd not yet allowed to be loud. We are walking through this ballroom now. Take a slow turn around it. Notice the things you would not normally notice. Notice the older women seated along the walls in small clusters, some with fans, some with small embroidered bags resting on their laps. Notice that these older women are not, despite appearances, idle. They are watching. They are watching everything. They are taking note of who is dancing with whom, and for how long. They are taking note of who has stepped out onto the terrace and with which companion. They are taking note of the conversations that are happening near the great windows, where the air is cooler and where the music is slightly muffled and where two heads bent close together can almost have a private moment. These older women, the dowagers, are the institutional memory of the ballroom. They will remember tonight in detail. They will compare notes, the morning after, in their parlours and over their breakfast trays. They will know, by 10 the next morning, which engagement is about to be announced, which marriage is about to fail, which fortune is about to be quietly diminished, which family is rising and which is falling. They will know all of this without having spoken to anyone in particular. They will have read the room, and the room will have told them everything. For our purposes, the most useful fact about a great ball is the cover it provides. In a room of 300 people, 2 people meeting briefly on a terrace are nothing. In a room of 300 people, a folded note slipped from one gloved hand to another is nothing. In a room of 300 people, an entire transaction can be concluded between 2 carefully chosen guests, and the transaction will leave no trace, and no observer will ever be able to point to the moment it happened. In our story, several such transactions are happening tonight. They are not dramatic. They never are. They look to anyone watching like the perfectly ordinary business of a ball. A woman in pale blue silk with a single diamond at her throat dances 3 times with a man not her husband. This is unusual. 3 dances with the same partner is at the edge of what is permitted. The dowagers note it. They will discuss it tomorrow. What they do not know is that the woman is not engaged in flirtation. The 2 of them, in the long minutes of the waltz, with the music covering their voices and the movement of the dance making any close observation impossible, are conducting a conversation about a particular shipment of goods that is to be redirected at the docks the following morning. The man is the agent of a buyer in another city. The woman is the agent of a seller in this one. They have not been introduced before tonight. They will not be introduced after. The conversation is the only conversation they will ever have. By the end of the 3rd dance, all the necessary terms have been settled. A woman in green velvet stands with her back to the wall, her fan held closed in her right hand. A footman passes with a tray of small glasses. He pauses near her. She lifts a glass. The fan, in her right hand, taps once against her wrist. The footman moves on. The single tap is a signal. It tells the footman, who is not really a footman in the way the others are, that she has received the information she had been waiting for, and that the next step in a particular sequence of steps may now proceed. The footman, half an hour later, will leave the ballroom on an ordinary errand. He will not return for the rest of the evening. No one will notice. A woman in cream lace stands near the great mirror at the far end of the room. She's speaking with an older man, the husband of one of her dearest friends. The conversation is animated. It is on the surface about a forthcoming horse race. The man is a great enthusiast for horses. He talks about horses constantly, and the woman, who knows this, has positioned herself to be his audience tonight. She listens. She smiles. She makes the right small comments at the right moments. While she listens, however, she's also, with her left hand, idly turning a small ring on her right hand. The ring has a stone of pale topaz. The stone catches the light at certain angles. Across the room, a young man, who appears to be entirely engaged in conversation with a young woman, glances over and notes the angle of the ring. He has been watching for it. The angle tells him a particular fact. He nods, almost imperceptibly, and continues his conversation with the young woman, who does not know she's being used as cover. These are ordinary moments at a ball. They are happening simultaneously, at perhaps a dozen points around the room. They are happening alongside hundreds of other moments which are exactly what they appear to be. The whole room, taken together, is producing a vast amount of information, of which only a small portion is the kind of information our women care about. The rest is noise. The noise is exactly what makes the signal possible. Without the noise, the signal would be visible. With the noise, the signal vanishes into the general roar of pleasant sociability. Now move slowly with us out of the ballroom. There is a long corridor leading away from the main room toward a smaller, quieter set of chambers, where the older guests sometimes retreat to play cards, or to converse without the noise of the orchestra. The corridor is dimly lit. The walls are hung with portraits of the family's ancestors, and with a few large landscape paintings of scenes in the Hudson Valley. In one of the smaller rooms off this corridor, a card game is in progress. 4 women sit at a small table covered in green baize. They are playing whist. The game is calm. The bidding is quiet. There is no money on the table, only small ivory counters, which are exchanged at the end of the evening for sums of no consequence. The 4 women are not, however, playing only whist. They are also, in the long pauses between hands, conducting a much larger discussion about a pooled investment they have arranged, the proceeds of which flow through a small trust company in another state. The trust company is registered in the name of a man who does not know it exists. He is on paper a clerk in an office 2,000 miles away. The 4 women have used his name with his benign and uncomprehending agreement in exchange for a small annual gift of money which arrives in his account each Christmas, and which he has never thought to question. The trust holds, by this point in our story, several $100,000 in assets. The assets have come from a variety of sources, some entirely respectable, some not. The 4 women manage the trust collectively. They meet like this every few months in different houses, under cover of card games or charity meetings or dinner parties. They keep no minutes, they write nothing down, they remember everything. Tonight they are deciding whether to expand their operations into a new city. The new city has certain advantages. It also has certain risks. The advantages are discussed in one hand of cards, the risks are discussed in the next. The decision is made over a third hand, with a small nod from each of the 4 when the right cards have been laid. The decision is to proceed, but slowly, and only after the placement of 2 reliable correspondents in the new city, women they have known for years and whose discretion they trust absolutely. At the end of the game, the women rise, they smooth their dresses, they exchange brief, warm farewells. They walk back together along the dim corridor toward the ballroom. In the ballroom, the orchestra is now playing the Great Waltz, the centerpiece of the evening, and the floor is full of dancers. The 4 women separate at the doorway, drift into the crowd, and within 5 minutes are indistinguishable from any of the other elderly female guests, fanning themselves gently, watching the dancers, smiling at acquaintances. By the end of the evening, 6 significant decisions have been made in this house. The decisions will affect, over the coming year, the movement of considerable sums of money across several states. They will result, indirectly, in the rise of one fortune and the slow, almost imperceptible decline of another. They will alter the lives of a number of people who were not present tonight, and will never know what was decided about them. The hostess, Mrs. Vale, eventually leaves her post at the top of the staircase. The receiving line has been over for some time. She moves through her own ball as a guest of sorts, gracious, smiling, never quite at the centre of any one conversation, always somehow available to whoever wishes to speak to her, never available to anyone for too long. By midnight she has had brief but meaningful exchanges with perhaps 20 of the most important guests. By 1 in the morning, the supper has been served and cleared. By 2, the older guests are beginning to depart. By 3, only the dancers remain, and even they are flagging. By 4 in the morning, the great house is quiet. The orchestra has packed up its instruments and gone. The footmen are extinguishing the candles in the chandeliers, one by one, with long brass snuffers on poles. The maids are sweeping up the small drifts of dance floor dust and lost feathers and broken glass. The flowers in the great arrangements are beginning to wilt in the warmth. The mirrored walls, no longer multiplying lights, show only the grey emptiness of the large room. In the kitchens below, the staff is still at work. The remains of the supper are being cleared. The plates are being scraped and stacked. The cook, who has been on her feet since 5 the previous morning, sits briefly on a stool by the great range, drinking a cup of tea, allowing herself a moment. The kitchen smells of cold meat and lemon and the tail end of the burning hearth. The kitchen maids move slowly, their feet sore. The whole great enterprise of the evening is wound down to its last rotations, the way a great wheel slows after the engine has been turned off. In the cloakroom, the last guests are recovering their coats. The cloakroom attendant, a woman who has been on her feet for 8 hours, hands out the wraps and the capes and the gentlemen's hats with the same calm professional courtesy she had shown at the start of the evening. She does not show her tiredness. She's been trained, like everyone else in this house, not to show what she feels. She accepts the small tip pressed into her hand by a departing gentleman, slips it into her pocket, smiles and turns to the next guest. In the stable yard behind the house, the carriages are pulling up in turn. The coachmen, also tired, also patient, hand down their employers and their employers' guests with practised courtesy. The horses, restless from standing in the cold for hours, stamp their feet and breathe out plumes of mist into the chill air. There is a smell of leather and horse and lamp oil. There is the soft sound of harness, the rumble of wheels on the cobblestones as each carriage rolls away, the diminishing clatter as it disappears down the side street and into the larger thoroughfare beyond. Mrs. Vale sits, alone now, in a small back parlour. She has changed out of her receiving dress. She wears a quiet dressing gown of dove-grey silk. A maid brings her a single cup of weak tea. She drinks it slowly, looking at the small fire in the grate. She does not write anything down. She does not need to. The night, in all its layers, is filed in her memory with the absolute precision of a card catalogue. Tomorrow, in her own morning room, she will translate what needs translating into the appropriate ledgers, and the rest of it will simply rest in her mind, available for retrieval whenever it is needed, for as long as it is needed, until it is no longer needed and is allowed, slowly, gently, to be forgotten. There is a particular satisfaction in a great evening well executed. She allows herself in this quiet half hour to taste it. She has hosted 300 guests. She has fed them, danced them, watered them with champagne, sent them home full of admiration for her hospitality. She has, beneath all of this, conducted with absolute precision the 6 specific transactions that were the actual purpose of the evening for her. The transactions are settled, the arrangements are made, the next steps are clear. The evening has, in business terms, paid for itself many times over. She finishes her tea. She sets the cup down on the small table beside her chair. She rises slowly, feeling the weight of her years in her knees. She walks down the hall to her own bedroom, where her maid is waiting with a cool basin of water and a fresh nightdress laid out on the bed. The maid undresses her. The maid brushes her white hair slowly, the way the hair has been brushed every night for 60 years. The maid says good night. The maid leaves. Mrs. Vale climbs into the bed. She does not sleep at once. She lies in the soft dark with her eyes open, listening to the great house settle around her. There are small creaks in the floorboards. There are small sighs of wood adjusting to the change in temperature. There is the very faint, very distant sound of the city beyond, a sound that never entirely stops, but that is, at this hour, as quiet as it ever becomes. She thinks of nothing in particular. She lets the thoughts come and go. After a time, perhaps 20 minutes, perhaps half an hour, she falls asleep and the great evening fully ends. Outside, the city is beginning its earlier stirrings. A milk wagon clatters along the avenue. A street lamp goes out. A first thin band of pale light appears in the eastern sky. The night that has just ended will be remembered, by the newspapers, as a great social event, a triumph of taste, an evening of unparalleled elegance. It will be described in detail in the morning columns. The dresses will be listed. The notable guests will be named. The flowers will be praised. None of the rest of it will be mentioned. None of the rest of it will need to be. The rest of it has already done its quiet work, and will continue in the slow, ordinary way of such things, to do its quiet work for a long time to come. Drift now, if you can, with the slow lightening of the dawn. The story will go on, but you do not need to follow it tightly. The room around you is warm. The bed is soft. The night is long. We have many more rooms to enter, and we will enter them gently, the way the sun enters a cold morning room slowly by degrees, without ever waking the sleepers. Every great house had rooms that visitors did not see. The visitor saw the entrance hall, the parlour, the drawing room, perhaps the dining room if the visit extended to a meal. Beyond those rooms lay a different geography, a series of more private chambers that belonged to the family alone. Tonight we walk through those rooms, we move quietly, we do not turn on the brighter lights. We go along the back stairs, past the linen closets and the housekeeper's pantry, and we enter the rooms where the real life of the house was lived. There was the morning room, which we have already visited. There was the boudoir, a small private sitting room belonging to the lady of the house, where she received only her closest friends and her dressmaker and her doctor. There was the lady's bedroom, with its great curtained bed, its dressing table, its private bath, its closets full of garments arranged by season and by occasion. There was, in some houses, a small private chapel, a room of polished wood and stained glass where the lady prayed in the early morning before the household was awake. There was, in many houses, a small library belonging to the lady, separate from the great library that belonged to the master, in which she kept her own books, her journals, her correspondence, her account books, her records of charitable activities, and, in a locked cabinet, the private papers that were not for any other eye. These rooms were sacred. The staff entered them only by invitation. The husband entered them rarely. The husband had his own corresponding rooms on his own side of the house, a study, a smoking room, perhaps a private office, perhaps a billiard room. The two halves of the house ran in parallel, with their own staff and their own rhythms, and they met chiefly at the dining table and in the formal reception rooms downstairs. In the ladies' library there was usually a writing desk of considerable elegance. The desk had drawers, some of the drawers locked. The keys were kept on a thin gold chain that the lady wore under her dress, suspended between her collarbone and her stays, where no one but her maid would ever see it, and the maid had been with her for so many years that she could be trusted not to ask questions about it. The locked drawers held the things that needed to be held. They held the lady's account books, separate from her husband's. They held her records of charitable trusts. They held her correspondence with her own lawyer, who was not the family lawyer, but a different lawyer engaged for matters of her own. They held, in some cases, the actual deeds and titles and transfer documents for properties and investments that stood in her name alone, or in the name of an entity she controlled, or in the name of a relative who acted on her behalf. By the 1880s, in many states of the Union, married women had begun to acquire the legal right to hold property in their own names. The Married Women's Property Acts, passed in different forms and at different times in different states, were a slow, uneven, grudging revolution. They did not give women everything. They certainly did not give women equality, but they gave women in many places the ability to inherit, to invest, to own, and to control assets that were genuinely their own, and that no husband could claim simply by virtue of marriage. The legal change had been slow. The practical use of the change, by women who had been raised in the old understanding, was even slower. But by the end of the century, a substantial number of married women in the great American cities held substantial assets in their own names, and many of those women were quietly using those assets to do things their husbands knew nothing about. This is the structural fact that made our composite stories possible. It is not the only fact, but it is a critical one. A woman who could legally own property in her own name could do many things she could not have done a generation earlier. She could open bank accounts, she could engage lawyers, she could enter into contracts, she could in principle be sued, but more importantly she could sue, and the threat of suit is often more useful than the actual filing of one. She could, in short, become a small economic actor in her own right, and a small economic actor with the networks of a society hostess and the discretion of a perfect lady was, as we have been seeing, an extraordinarily powerful figure. The lady's lawyer, by the way, deserves a word. He was usually an older man, often a widower, often someone the lady had known since childhood, often someone who had grown up in a family allied with hers. He was not the family lawyer who handled the husband's affairs. He was hers alone. He came to the house once a week or once a month, depending on the season and the volume of business. He was received in the small library upstairs. He brought a leather portfolio. They had tea. They reviewed papers. He left. He was, in his way, the keystone of the operation. Whatever the lady was doing in the broader world, the legal forms had to be perfect, or the whole thing could collapse. The legal forms were his department. He drafted the trusts. He registered the corporations. He composed the contracts. He filed what needed to be filed. He kept silent about everything else. His discretion was absolute and was secured by an arrangement of mutual trust that had been built up over decades, and by a generous retainer, and by the simple fact that his entire professional reputation depended on the satisfaction of clients of exactly this kind, and that exposing one of them would have been the ruin of his practice. These older lawyers, the small army of them who served the women of the great houses, are an almost invisible feature of Gilded Age America. They appear in the records, when they appear at all, only as names on the corners of legal documents. They were essential. Without them, the systems we are describing could not have functioned. With them, the systems were almost unbreakable. In the lady's bedroom, the bed itself was a piece of architecture. 4 posts, sometimes carved, sometimes plain, a canopy of heavy fabric, curtains that could be drawn entirely closed, turning the bed into a private inner room within the larger room, a great mattress, 2 great mattresses sometimes layered on top of each other, with a feather bed laid on top of the mattresses for extra softness. Linen sheets, ironed by the laundress with a charcoal iron that left, when not handled correctly, a faint smell of hot metal. Pillows of down, a counterpane of quilted silk, a bell rope hanging beside the headboard, by which the lady could summon her maid in the night. The bedroom itself was usually large, larger than the bedrooms of later eras, because it served as the lady's main private retreat, as well as the place where she slept. It contained, beyond the bed, a chaise longue for resting in the afternoon, a small writing desk for letters that were too personal even for the morning room, a wardrobe for daily clothes, a dressing table with 3 mirrors angled to show the lady her own face from 3 sides at once, and a small cabinet for the various small possessions of the toilette, the bottles of scent, the silver brushes, the boxes of pins. The walls were papered in a soft pattern, often a small floral print on a pale background, chosen for its soothing quality. The carpet was thick. The fire in the grate was kept burning in cold weather all night, refreshed by a maid who tiptoed in twice during the deep hours to add a quiet handful of coal. The lady, retiring to this bed at the end of a long evening, had a particular ritual. The maid undressed her. The maid took down her hair. The maid brushed the hair, slowly for a long time with a silver brush. The hair was the lady's pride often, and the brushing was a private pleasure. The maid braided the hair loosely for sleeping. The maid brought a small glass of water on a silver tray, with perhaps a single biscuit on a small plate. The lady drank the water. The lady ate, or did not eat, the biscuit. The maid extinguished all the lights but one, a small lamp on the bedside table. The maid said good night. The lady said good night. The door closed. The lady was alone. Or rather, the lady was as alone as she ever was. There was, after all, a maid sleeping on a small bed in a small adjoining room, called the dressing room or the maid's room, separated from the main bedroom only by a single door that could be left ajar if the lady wished. The maid would hear, in the night, if the lady stirred. The maid would come at the first sound of the bell. The lady was, in this sense, never entirely without company. She was watched over, in her sleep, the way she had been watched over in her cradle as an infant. The watchfulness was the same watchfulness, unchanged across her entire life, the watchfulness of women in the next room who exist to be available the moment they are needed and to be invisible the rest of the time. In that hour, the hour just before sleep, certain things came back to her. The transactions of the day, the conversations of the evening, the faces of the guests at the recent ball, the look in her own husband's eyes at dinner, which was sometimes loving and sometimes preoccupied and sometimes, occasionally, slightly puzzled, as if he had glimpsed for a moment that something larger was happening around him but could not quite say what. She sometimes thought about her father, or her mother, or the woman who had taught her, in girlhood, to embroider. She sometimes thought about the women who worked in her own household, the cook in the basement kitchen who would be up again at 5 tomorrow morning to begin the day, the laundress who came on Mondays, the seamstress who came in for repairs and alterations, the gardener who came in the spring to tend the small back garden. She thought about the lives all of these women were living, and the relation those lives had to her own. She thought sometimes, with a complicated feeling she did not entirely allow herself to name, about whether she was doing right or wrong by any of them, and whether the world she was helping to keep running was a world she would in any case have chosen. She did not always reach a clear answer to these questions. She had been raised to function, not to philosophize, and she functioned well, and the philosophy, when it surfaced, was politely set aside. She put out the small lamp. The room was very dark. The curtains of the bed enclosed her like a soft, dim cave. The breathing of the house, the small creakings of wood and the faint distant ticking of clocks were the lullabies of her childhood and her adulthood and her old age, and she fell asleep in their familiar music, and the city outside continued its slow, tireless turning, and the next day was already, somewhere, beginning. It is worth pausing for a moment to consider the specific objects that lived in the locked drawers we have been discussing. We will not enumerate them all because there are too many, and because every household had its own particular variations. But a sketch is possible. There would be, almost always, a small ledger book bound in dark leather, with the lady's initials stamped on the cover, in which the household accounts were kept by hand. There would be, in some households, a second ledger book, similar to the first but slightly different in its labelling, in which the accounts of certain other operations were kept, encoded so that an outside reader would mistake them for additional household expenses. There would be a small set of keys kept on a ring for various other locked items in the house, the wine cellar, the silver chest, the linen closet, the case in the master bedroom that held the lady's jewels. There would be, in many households, a small bound book of names and addresses, kept in the lady's own hand, listing the principal correspondence of her network with brief notes about each. The notes would be terse, almost telegraphic, and would mean very little to any reader who did not know the underlying conventions. There would be old letters, kept in bundles tied with ribbon, from particular correspondents whom she trusted absolutely, and from whom she had received messages of more than ordinary importance over the years. The letters were preserved against the small chance that she might one day need to refer back to a precise wording, but most letters of the more delicate kind were burned soon after reading, and the bundles in the drawer represented the small percentage that had been deemed worth keeping. There might be, in the most carefully managed households, a small pasteboard box containing tiny slips of paper, each with a single name or initial or coded reference, kept as a kind of working file. The lady would consult this box when she needed to remember a detail, would take out a slip, would read it, would replace it. The box was, in its small way, the analogue equivalent of a memory aid for matters too sensitive to be remembered openly. Some women had elaborate systems of colour coding within their boxes, with slips of different shades indicating different kinds of information. The systems were idiosyncratic, devised by the individual women, and would not have been comprehensible to anyone else. Finally, in the deepest part of the locked compartment, the part that even the lawyer rarely saw, there would sometimes be a small packet of items that the lady had decided to keep for reasons of her own. A photograph of a person no longer living, a pressed flower from an event of personal significance, a small piece of jewellery inherited from a great-grandmother, a folded letter from her own girlhood, addressed to her by a friend who had since died. These items had no business value. They were the deepest layer of the personal, the things she would not part with, the small relics of her own actual feelings beneath all the management and the discretion. She looked at them rarely. She knew they were there. The knowing in itself was a kind of comfort. This was the inner life behind the outer life. This was the third room behind the second room behind the first room. The visitor saw the parlour. The friend saw the morning room. The husband saw the dining room and the bedroom, but not the locked drawer. Only the lady herself and her lawyer, and perhaps a single trusted confidant in another house, saw the whole architecture. The architecture was hers. She had inherited some of it. She had built much of it. She would in due course pass some of it on to a daughter, or a niece, or a goddaughter, or an unrelated young woman she had taken under her wing because the young woman had reminded her of herself at 15. The continuity, generation to generation, was part of the strength of the system. These were not flash-in-the-pan operations. They were patient, slow, multi-generational. The great male enterprises of the era, The railroads and the steel mills and the oil companies were built and shattered within decades. The quieter female enterprises, the slow networks of trust and information and discrete capital, sometimes ran for 60 or 70 or 80 years, passed quietly from one woman to another, each woman trained from girlhood by the woman before her. Some of these networks may, in attenuated forms, be running still. We will probably never know. That is the point. That is the design. The lady's last thought before sleep was sometimes a small one: tomorrow's menu, the arrangement of flowers for a coming dinner, a note she had forgotten to write. The small thoughts were a kind of mercy. They kept the larger thoughts from overwhelming her. She drifted into them as into a familiar shallow water, and from there she drifted further, into the quiet open sea of sleep, and the day's complexities released their hold on her, one by one, and she was at last, for a few hours, no longer a perfect socialite or a quiet organizer or anything else, but a sleeping woman in a curtained bed in a quiet house, in a great city in a country that was, at that moment, slowly turning under the same stars that turn now over yours. Some of these enterprises in our composite picture reached far beyond the city in which they began. We have spent the early acts of our story in a single city, in a single neighbourhood, in a single house. But the world was, even then, a connected world. Steamships left for Europe twice a week. Trains moved across the continent in 3 or 4 days. Telegraph wires ran under the ocean. A letter posted in New York on Monday morning could be in London by the following Tuesday or Wednesday, depending on the weather. The networks our women built did not need to remain local, and many of them did not. Tonight we trace very gently the long reach of one such network. It begins, in our story, with a woman in Boston in the 1870s. She's the daughter of a sea captain whose family had made its fortune in the China trade, decades earlier, when American ships ran from Boston to Canton and brought back tea and silk and porcelain, and, sometimes, less respectable cargoes that the family did not discuss in later generations. The fortune is old by Boston standards, though not by European standards. The house is on Beacon Hill. The drawing room overlooks the common. The walls are panelled in dark wood. There are old paintings of ships at sea. There is a particular smell to the house, a smell of beeswax and book leather and salt that drifts up from the harbour on certain winds. The woman, in our composite, is named Mrs. Endicott. She's widowed in her 30s. Her husband had been a merchant of moderate success and considerable charm. After his death, she took control of his affairs, with the help of her own lawyer and her late father's old shipping clerk. She found, on close examination, that her husband's affairs were in slightly worse condition than his charm had suggested. She also found that the clerk was a man of unusual intelligence and discretion. Together, over a decade, they reorganized the firm. They opened new lines, they closed old ones, they built relationships with correspondents in Liverpool, in Le Havre, in Hamburg, in Hong Kong. Mrs. Endicott did not appear in any of these business dealings publicly. Officially, the firm was now run by the clerk, who had been promoted and was now a partner. Privately, every important decision passed through Mrs. Endicott's morning room, where she received the partner once a week for tea and reviewed the firm's books. The books were brought to her in a leather portfolio. She read them carefully. She made small marks in pencil. She returned the portfolio to the partner. The partner went away and did what she had indicated. The firm prospered. This was the legitimate side. There was, as the story would have it, another side. Mrs. Endicott had a particular interest in certain kinds of cargoes. The interest was inherited. Her father had built the family's first fortune partly through the discreet handling of goods that were not, strictly speaking, cleared at every step of their journey. He had not spoken about this to anyone except, in his last years, to her. He had told her, sitting in this same drawing room, that there was a particular pattern of routes through the Caribbean and through certain small ports in Central America that had served his family well, and that the routes were maintained, generation to generation, by relationships with particular families in those ports, families whose names she should remember, and which she should never write down except in a particular small book that he gave her on his deathbed, and which she should keep, after his death, in a particular small safe behind a panel in his old study. She had taken the book, she had kept the safe, she had used the routes. By the time of our story, the routes carry mostly legitimate goods. Mrs. Endicott has, over the years, scaled back the more questionable elements of what passes through her father's old network. She prefers, she has decided, to make her secret money in safer ways. The routes still carry, however, certain items that move through the customs houses of certain ports without quite the level of inspection that other items receive. The fees for this discretion are paid year after year to families whose grandparents' had come to similar arrangements with her own grandparents'. This is the long reach we're tracing. It is not just a network across a city. It is a network across an ocean, and across a generation, and across a generation, and across another generation. It is a quiet, slowly modernizing inheritance, kept alive by women, mostly because women did not change jobs and did not move offices and did not retire and were not, in the same way as men, required to publicly hand on their authority. A man retired. He named a successor. The name was published. The successor became visible. A woman simply continued until she did not, and then a younger woman took up the pen, and the only people who noticed were the people who had been in on it all along. The other end of the network in our composite was a household in Liverpool, England. Liverpool in the late 19th century was one of the great ports of the world. Ships came and went day and night. The docks ran for miles. The customs house was one of the most active in the British Empire. The merchants of Liverpool had houses in the better suburbs, on tree-lined streets where the air was cleaner. One of these houses, in our story, belonged to a Mrs. Hargreaves, a widow of about Mrs. Endicott's age, who had inherited her late husband's interest in the cotton trade. Mrs. Hargreaves and Mrs. Endicott had never met in person. They had corresponded for almost 30 years. The letters were polite, friendly, full of the small details of running a household and of family news. They mentioned in passing certain shipments. They mentioned in passing certain prices. They mentioned in passing certain family connections of mutual friends. And the mentions of these family connections were, in fact, the way the women told each other which agents they were currently trusting, which agents had become unreliable, which new agents could be brought in. We can imagine gently the rhythms of the Liverpool house. Mrs. Hargreaves rose like her American counterpart before the rest of the household was fully awake. Liverpool mornings in autumn were heavy with river fog. She could see it from her bedroom window lying in soft grey banks over the rooftops of the suburb, with the masts of ships rising through it in the middle distance, like the bare branches of trees in a winter wood. The bells of the city churches sounded muffled through the fog. The cries of the milkman and the coalman and the boy with the morning papers came from a few streets away, distant and softened, as if the fog itself were holding them at a respectful remove. She would draw on her dressing gown and ring for her own morning tea and stand at the window for a few minutes, letting the city wake around her before turning to the day. Her morning room was on the first floor at the back of the house, looking onto a small garden bounded by a brick wall stained dark with the long damp of a northern climate. The garden held a single old apple tree, a few rose bushes, a strip of lawn, and a stone bench under the wall where she sometimes sat in summer. The morning room itself was furnished simply by the standards of her class. A writing desk under the window, a small fire in the grate lit by a maid before she came down, a round table near the fire where her tea would be set out, a few frame prints on the wall, mostly of ships, and one watercolour of a particular cove in Wales where she had spent summers as a girl. The room smelled faintly of beeswax and of the lavender that one of the maids placed each week in a small bowl on the writing desk. The American letters arrived on Thursdays generally. They came up from the docks with the morning post. They were carried into the house by a footman and placed on a silver tray on the hall table. By the time Mrs. Hargreaves came down to her morning room, the tray was already there, with the day's correspondence sorted in the small particular order her butler had been keeping for years. The American letters were always near the top. She would take her tea first, slowly, and only then would she pick up the letter from Boston and turn it over in her hands once, and break the seal carefully, and unfold the pages, and begin to read. Reading the letters was, for her, a slow business. Each letter contained on its surface a quiet narrative of family life in Boston, a son who had married well, a grandchild who was learning to walk, the garden, the weather, the health of mutual acquaintances. Beneath the surface there were the actual messages. The mention of a particular cousin's recovery from a recent illness was a coded reference to an agent in Havana. The reference to a charitable bazaar in a particular church was a reference to a shipment expected at a particular date. The pieces were small. The pieces had to be assembled in her mind into the actual communication. She had been doing this for decades, and she did it now almost without conscious effort. The way a fluent reader of a foreign language no longer notices that they are reading a foreign language at all. When she'd read the letter twice, she would set it aside, pour a fresh cup of tea, and consider her reply. The reply, like the letter she had received, would have a surface and a hidden body. The surface would be warm, particular, full of the details of her own household. The hidden body would convey the information her correspondent needed. She wrote the letter directly, in a clear, careful hand, without preliminary drafts, because preliminary drafts would have left more paper in the world than was prudent. When the letter was finished, she folded it, sealed it with her own private wax, addressed it, and gave it to the footman to be posted on the next outgoing mail steamer. The original letter from Boston she would carry herself into the small back parlour, where she would place it on the fire and watch it curl and blacken and shrink to nothing. The fire took the secret. The fire was, as she sometimes thought, the third party to the correspondence and the most reliable of the three. We can sit for a moment with this small ritual. The letter arriving, the tea, the slow reading, the slow reply, the burning of the original. It happened, with variations, in many houses, on both sides of the ocean, on quiet weekday mornings in cities full of other people doing other work, none of it visible to anyone outside the room. It was, in a sense, the heartbeat of these networks. Slow, steady, regular, each beat almost identical to the one before, none of them dramatic, all of them necessary. The letters kept together would have made a fascinating archive. Almost nothing in any single letter would have looked suspicious. Read together, in order, by someone who knew what to look for, they would have revealed a steady, decades-long collaboration of considerable scope. The letters were not, of course, kept together. Mrs. Endicott burned hers as soon as she'd written and remembered her replies. Mrs. Hargreaves did the same. Both women had been raised to understand the value of paper and the danger of it. This was a fact about these networks. They preferred, where possible, to leave no record. They used ledgers, but the ledgers were brief and coded and locked away. They used letters, but the letters were burned. They used messengers, but the messengers did not know what they were carrying. They used contracts, but the contracts referred only to legitimate transactions, and the broader arrangements lay outside any contractual form, secured instead by reputation and by the long memory of mutual obligation. A historian looking back can reconstruct only fragments. The whole picture has been deliberately allowed to fade. This frustrates a certain kind of curiosity. We would like to know exactly how much was moved, and to where, and at what profit. We would like to know the names. We would like to know the precise structure of the arrangements. We have, in most cases, very little of this information. What we have is the shape of the thing, the outline visible through the gaps in the records, the way a building under heavy snow can be perceived as a building, even when only the outline of the roof is visible. We can say with some confidence that there were such networks. Court records, when they appear, hint at them. The occasional diary or letter, surviving by accident in an archive, mentions something curious. Decades later, when descendants are clearing out family papers, small items occasionally surface that would have meant nothing to anyone at the time, but that, placed in the broader context, suggest more than they say. A small notebook of dates and initials, a bundle of receipts from a port that no one in the family had any obvious reason to be doing business with, a signet ring with an unfamiliar device on it, kept for some reason in a drawer of a writing desk in a country house, whose original purpose no one can now explain. These small items are like the few stones one finds, sometimes, scattered on a moor where, the historian later realises, an ancient road must have run. The road has long since been swallowed by the moor. The stones remain. From the stones, one can sketch the road. The sketch will not be complete. Much will be guessed at. But the road was there, and the people who walked it were real, and the things they carried mattered. We can imagine very gently one such shipment moving through the network. It begins, in our composite picture, in a warehouse in a small port in the Caribbean, in the late afternoon of a hot day in August. The warehouse is one of several along a wooden wharf. It is built of weathered planks, with a tin roof that ticks and pops in the heat. Inside, the air is heavy with the smell of coffee and salt and old rope, and the slightly sweet smell of cane sugar that pervades the entire town. There are crates stacked along one wall. There are barrels in another corner. A small foreman, a man of about 50 with very dark skin, and the calm, watchful eyes of someone who has spent his life around shipping, is reviewing a paper handed to him by a younger man who has come up from the harbour to deliver it. The foreman reads the paper. He nods. He makes a small mark in a ledger. He gives an instruction to 2 labourers in a quick exchange of Spanish, and the labourers begin shifting certain crates from one part of the warehouse to another part. The crates, to a casual observer, look identical to the others. They are not. The crates being moved have a particular small mark in chalk on one corner, a mark that the foreman has put there himself, and the mark indicates that these crates are part of a particular consignment that will be loaded onto a particular ship the following morning. That ship, when it sails, will carry a mixed cargo. Most of it will be entirely legitimate. Coffee, sugar, hides, a few barrels of rum. A small portion of it in the marked crates will be the kind of cargo that does not appear in quite the same form on the official manifest. The captain of the ship knows this. He has known it for years. He is paid, every voyage, a small additional sum that does not appear in the company's books, in exchange for not asking questions about the marked crates. He does not ask questions. He has a family in a port city far to the north, and the additional small sum has been useful, over the years, for school fees and for medical bills, and for the small comforts that working captains do not on their official wages easily afford. The ship sails the next morning at dawn. The marked crates are below deck, stowed among the legitimate cargo. The voyage in our story takes 10 days. The weather is moderate. There is one minor storm on the 7th night that requires reefing the topsails and altering course briefly, but otherwise the voyage is uneventful. The ship arrives at a small port in the southern United States on a clear morning in late August. The marked crates are unloaded by a small crew that the foreman in the Caribbean port has, by long arrangement, alerted in advance. The crates are taken in 2 wagons to a particular warehouse on the edge of the town. From there, by another arrangement, they are taken in smaller lots by railroad north. The railroad shipments are split. Some go to one buyer, some go to another, some go to a third. Each buyer pays a slightly different price, agreed in advance, into accounts that are managed in turn by particular small banks in particular small cities, and the monies, after a complex but well-rehearsed series of transfers, eventually find their way, in the form of a quarterly remittance, into the legitimate accounts of a respectable shipping firm in Boston. The legitimate shipping firm in Boston records the remittance as a payment for services rendered by a subsidiary office in the Caribbean. The accounting is impeccable. Auditors, when they review the books, find no irregularities. The firm has prospered year after year doing the kind of legitimate business that a Boston shipping firm of its size and history might be expected to do. The slight extra prosperity, the small increment of additional success that distinguishes this firm from its competitors, is not visible in any single year's accounts. It is visible only across decades, and even then only to a very careful observer, and even then only as a faint pattern that could be attributed to many things, including the firm's reputation for unusually careful management. Mrs. Endicott in her morning room in Boston never sees any of this. She does not visit the Caribbean port. She does not visit the Southern American port. She does not visit the warehouses or the railroads or the buyers. She does not, in fact, visit anywhere connected with the actual movement of the goods. She sits in her morning room, she drinks her tea, she reads her letters, she writes her replies, she reviews, once a quarter, the books her partner brings to her in the leather portfolio. She makes her small pencil marks, she returns the portfolio. The system runs, the shipments move, the money arrives. The legitimate firm prospers. The illegitimate increment is folded, almost invisibly, into the legitimate increment, and the whole structure is, in this respect, very nearly perfect. And Mrs. Endicott, in her morning room, is, in this respect, the calm, intelligent centre of a great quiet machine, almost none of which she ever directly touches. This was the texture of these enterprises. They were not, on any given day, dramatic. They did not involve, on most days, anything that even looked unusual. They involved instead 1,000 small ordinary acts of business, each one of which was, in itself, almost entirely ordinary, and each one of which was, in its proper place in the larger pattern, a small necessary contribution to a structure that no individual within it could quite see. The lady at the centre could see it. The lady at the centre had built it. The lady at the centre kept it running year after year by the small steady application of attention, taste, judgment, and care. In our story, Mrs. Endicott and Mrs. Hargreaves, in their different cities, in their different houses, on their different sides of the great ocean, kept up their slow correspondence and their slow business for almost 3 decades. They never met. They never spoke on a telephone. They never sent a telegram of any importance. They only wrote letters. The letters arrived. The replies arrived. The shipments moved. The money, in small reasonable amounts, accumulated. The two of them grew old together at a distance. There were, scattered between Boston and Liverpool, the actual moving parts of all this. The ships, the men on the ships, the clerks in the customs houses, the small ports in the Caribbean and the smaller ports along the coasts of Mexico and Central America. The agents in those ports, often men whose grandfathers had worked with Mrs. Endicott's grandfather, men whose names appeared nowhere in any official record but who knew, when a particular kind of vessel arrived on a particular tide, what was expected of them and what would be in due course delivered. These men did not on the whole know that their counterparties at the far end of the chain were 2 old women in respectable suburbs of 2 great cities. They knew only the agents who appeared at their docks, and the bills of lading that those agents brought, and the small payments that were made afterward in the local currency. This was in itself a kind of architecture. The network was distributed deliberately so that no one person in it knew the whole of it. The captain of a ship knew only his immediate orders. The clerk in the customs house knew only the documents he was given to sign. The agent in the small port knew only his own region. The lawyer in Boston knew only the legal frame of the legitimate business. The clerk in Liverpool knew only the cotton accounts. The 2 women at the centre knew the whole, and they kept the whole in their own heads, and they did not write the whole down anywhere. And so the whole, while it functioned, was held only in the memory of 2 living minds, and in the slow flow of letters that were burned as soon as they had been read. It was, in this respect, an extraordinarily fragile and extraordinarily durable structure at once. Fragile, because if either woman had died unexpectedly without having trained a successor, large parts of the network would have collapsed within months. Durable, because the same diffusion of knowledge that made it fragile also made it nearly impossible to attack. There was no central ledger that an enemy could seize. There was no single individual whose arrest would unravel the chain. The network lived, in effect, in the small private ritual of 2 women drinking tea and writing letters in 2 suburban morning rooms, 4,000 miles apart, on Tuesday and Thursday mornings respectively, year after year, for nearly 30 years. We can think, also, about the human texture of the correspondence itself. The 2 women, although they had never met, had become, in their own carefully bounded way, friends. The letters carried, alongside the business, real warmth. Mrs. Hargreaves, when her son fell seriously ill in his 13th year, wrote about it to Mrs. Endicott, and Mrs. Endicott wrote back with the kind of careful sympathy that one mother offers another. Mrs. Endicott, when her own husband died, wrote a brief letter to Liverpool, and Mrs. Hargreaves, who had been a widow for 15 years already, replied with the kind of measured comfort that only another widow can offer. The friendship was real. It was conducted entirely on paper. It survived, intact, until the death of one of the women, and it survived in its diluted way, the transition to the next generation, and the friendships of women in this position were often, like this, distant, letter-bound, conducted across great spaces and across long periods of time, real. Mrs. Hargreaves died first, in the early 1900s. Her daughter, who had been gradually trained in the work, took over. She wrote to Mrs. Endicott a careful letter announcing her mother's death, and offering, in the gentlest terms, to continue the correspondence if Mrs. Endicott wished. Mrs. Endicott wrote back, expressing her deepest sympathy, and saying that she would be pleased, if it suited the daughter, to continue the small exchanges of family news to which she had so long been accustomed. The letters resumed, the shipments continued, the continuity held. Mrs. Endicott herself died perhaps a decade later. By then she had identified a successor of her own, a young cousin of considerable promise. The young cousin received the small notebooks, the safe combination, the introductions to the partner of the firm and to the lawyer, and the long memorized network of names. She continued the work for another 30 years. She in turn identified a successor. The chain continued perhaps into the middle of the 20th century. By then the original purposes of the network had largely faded. The questionable shipments had ceased to be needed or worthwhile, and the network was used, if it was used at all, only for the legitimate side of the family business. But the structure remained, and the discipline remained, and the habit of trust remained, and somewhere in a desk in a quiet house in Boston, a small notebook may, even now, sit in a drawer that has not been opened for decades, the names inside it meaningless to the descendants who do not understand what they have inherited. This is the long reach of a woman's name. It is not the reach of fame. None of these women were famous. Their names did not appear in the great histories. Their portraits, if they were painted at all, hang now in family parlours of distant relatives, where the relatives know only that great-great-grandmother was, by all accounts, a remarkable woman of her generation. The reach of the name was different. It was the reach of unbroken continuity, of patient building, of careful concealment. It was the reach of 1,000 small decisions made well, over a long time, by people who had been trained from childhood to make exactly that kind of decision. You can rest in this for a moment. Let the long lines of these networks dissolve in your mind. They're too complicated to follow in any precise way, and they're too quiet to leave a clear shape. They are like the water of a deep, slow river. The river is moving, it is going somewhere. But standing on its bank in the dark, you cannot quite see the current. You can only feel that something large is moving, very slowly, very steadily, in a direction you cannot quite name. That is enough. The river will keep moving whether you watch it or not. You can let yourself drift. We come now to a question that has been waiting patiently in the corner of our story. It is the question of conscience. We have walked through the houses. We have admired the architecture. We have traced the long reach of these quiet networks. We have perhaps even allowed ourselves a small, complicated admiration for the women who built them, women who turned the suffocating training of perfect femininity into a tool of remarkable power. But we have not yet asked, gently, what these women thought of themselves. We have not asked whether they slept well, whether they prayed, whether they ever, in the silence of their boudoir, faced any reckoning with the fact that some of what they did would not have stood the light of day. The honest answer, drawn from the few private papers that have survived, is varied. Some of these women appear to have had no moral difficulty whatsoever with what they were doing. They had been raised to understand that the world was a competition for resources and respectability, and that those who arranged matters cleverly were rewarded, and those who did not were not, and that the business of being a serious person in the world was the business of arranging matters cleverly within the constraints one was given. They considered calmly that the laws of their country had not been written by women, that the laws served the interests of men, and that a woman who used the small openings in those laws to provide for her family and to exercise her own judgment was simply doing what any man in her position would have done with much less subtlety and much less finesse. These women, when they thought about their lives at all, thought of themselves as competent, as responsible, as effective. They paid their household staff well. They paid their suppliers promptly. They contributed generously to their churches. They funded hospitals and orphanages and charities of every description. They wrote affectionate letters to their children and grandchildren. They lived on the whole well-ordered lives, and they died with their accounts settled, and their houses in order, and their consciences by their own accounts untroubled. Other women, however, struggled. The struggle was rarely visible to anyone outside their own private papers, and the private papers, where they survive, tend to be heavily guarded by descendants. But the fragments we have suggest that some of these women did, late at night, in the silence of their boudoir, encounter a more difficult set of questions. They were, after all, women who had been raised in churches. They had been taught about right and wrong. They had been taught, in particular, that women were the moral guardians of the family and the nation, and that the soft work of women, the raising of children, the management of households, the cultivation of refinement, was the spiritual counterweight to the rougher work of men in the marketplace. To find oneself in middle age conducting a quiet enterprise that was, in some of its branches, rather a long way from any conventional notion of moral guardianship, was to find oneself sometimes awake at 3 a.m. with no one but oneself to consult. What did these women conclude in those long hours? The fragments suggest a few common conclusions. First, many of them concluded that the world they lived in was not the world the Church described. The church described a world of clear right and clear wrong. The world they actually navigated was a world of constant compromise, in which the men in the offices around them were every day doing things considerably more violent and more harmful than anything the women were doing in their parlours. The men were arranging contracts that ruined whole towns. The men were running mills in which children worked 12 hours a day. The men were building railroads on land taken from people who had not consented. The men were, in the language of a generation later, the visible architecture of an economic system whose costs were paid by a great many people who were not at the dinner table. The women, in their parlours, were running, in comparison, modest little enterprises that touched far fewer lives and ruined far fewer of them. This was not, of course, an exoneration. It was a comparative judgment. It said, in effect, that if what the men were doing was permissible, then what the women were doing was also permissible. The women had not chosen the standard. They had merely measured themselves against it. Second, many of these women drew a careful distinction between certain kinds of irregular activity and other kinds. They were prepared to engage in the discreet handling of goods, the avoidance of certain duties, the clever use of legal forms to protect family wealth. They were not, in most cases, prepared to engage in activities that involved direct physical harm to other people. The line between these two categories was not always clear, and the line shifted over time, but the existence of the line mattered to them. They told themselves, and they told each other, that they were running a particular kind of business, and that the particular kind of business they were running did not involve the kinds of acts that they considered unforgivable. This, again, was not a moral exoneration. It was a self-imposed limit. It said, in effect, that within a certain range of activities they would proceed, and outside that range they would not. The lines they drew were sometimes generous to themselves. They were also in most cases real, and most of these women adhered to them, and the discipline of adhering to them was part of what kept their networks functioning over decades, because a woman who did not adhere to her own limits was a woman who could not be trusted, and trust was the only currency that mattered. Third, many of these women understood that the worst part of what they were doing from their own moral standpoint was the deception of their husbands. This was the part that troubled them most. They were married women. They had taken vows. They had promised to love and honour their husbands, and there was, in the long quiet of a marriage of 20 or 30 or 40 years, a great deal of love and honour that did in fact pass between them and their men. The deception was a wound in that love. It did not heal. It scarred over, sometimes thickly, but it did not disappear. The wound was the price of the work, and it was paid every day, and the women bore it as best they could. Some of them, late in life, told their husbands. The conversations were rare, but they happened. A woman of 70, sitting with her husband in the autumn of their lives, in a quiet sitting room in a country house, would say, slowly, that there were certain things she had done, over the years, that she wished now to tell him about. The husband, who was usually by that point a man who had spent decades sensing without knowing, would listen. He might be angry, he might be hurt, he might in some cases be relieved as if a final unspoken weight had been lifted. He might in other cases simply be tired. The conversation would not undo the years, but it would sometimes allow the marriage to end honestly, and that ending mattered to the woman, and the husband, in his own way, would in many cases come to value it as well. Most of the women, however, never told. The deception lasted as long as the marriage. The husband died not knowing. The wife was left, sometimes, with the strange grief of having been unable to share the most active part of her own life with the person who'd been closest to her. This is one of the quieter griefs in our story, and it deserves a moment of acknowledgement. These women, even those of them who would not, in retrospect, repent of the work they did, often did regret, very deeply, that they could not have shared it with the person they had loved most. We can imagine, gently, one such evening of unshared knowledge. A husband and a wife, both in their early 60s, sit together in a small upstairs sitting room after dinner. The fire is low. He's reading a newspaper. She's doing some small piece of embroidery, or has a book open on her lap that she is not, in fact, reading. The room is comfortable. They have known each other for 40 years. They have raised children together. They have buried between them several parents and one infant son. They have shared, in the conventional sense, almost everything, and she is at this moment considering whether to begin a conversation she has been considering for nearly a decade. She has rehearsed it, in private, many times. She knows the words she would use. She has thought through the likely sequence of his responses. She has prepared even the small gestures of comfort she would offer at certain points, and the small concession she would make. She has in some sense already lived the conversation, repeatedly in her own mind. She does not in the end begin it. She does not begin it for several reasons. She is not certain he would understand. She is not certain it would change anything. She is not certain that the truth, set down between them in this particular sitting room on this particular evening, would not become its own kind of weight on the remaining years they had together. She is also simply tired. The keeping of the secret has become, by now, a familiar weight, a weight she has carried so long that she no longer notices it most of the time, and the unburdening of it would, in some ways, leave her oddly empty, oddly without the structure she has lived inside for so long. She's not sure she wants that emptiness, so she does not begin. She continues with her embroidery. He continues with his paper. The fire burns down a little further. The clock on the mantel chimes the hour. They wish each other a quiet good night and go to their separate beds, as they have for years, and the conversation she'd prepared remains, as it has remained, sealed inside her, and it stays sealed there for the rest of her life. This is not exactly tragedy. Many marriages in many eras have included larger and smaller withholdings on both sides. The withholding in our story is perhaps larger than most, but it is not the loneliest thing in the world. The marriages in question were often, by the standards of the time, genuinely affectionate. The husbands, in many cases, were good men. The wives, in many cases, loved them. The structure within which they all lived was a structure that did not, on the whole, encourage the kind of deep mutual knowledge between spouses that later generations would come to expect. The husbands kept their own private worlds, in their offices and their clubs. The wives kept theirs, in their parlours and their morning rooms. The marriage was, in many cases, the meeting place of these two private worlds, and the meeting place was warm enough, and the private worlds were left private, and that, in their understanding, was how a long marriage was conducted with grace. We should not project onto these women the loneliness we might feel in their place. Many of them did not, in their own terms, feel lonely. They had their work, they had their friends, they had their children and grandchildren, they had the slow accumulating satisfactions of a life carefully built. The husband's lack of full knowledge was, for many of them, simply part of the landscape, no more lonely-making than the lack of full knowledge between any two human beings who happened to be sharing a life. They did not expect total transparency. They did not, in many cases, particularly want it. They wanted what they had, which was a long, companionable shared life, conducted on the terms their world provided, and they considered it, on balance, sufficient. Fourth, and perhaps most interestingly, many of these women grew in later life into a kind of sober and complicated philanthropy. The fortunes they had quietly built, sometimes considerably greater than anyone outside their immediate circle suspected, were turned, in the last decades of their lives, toward causes they cared about: hospitals, schools, orphanages, homes for unmarried mothers, libraries, music conservatories, art collections that would be donated to museums. The list is long, and many institutions in many American cities owe more to women of this kind than the institutions themselves now realize. This was not, on the part of the women, a simple matter of guilt. Some of it was guilt. Some of it was something more complicated. They were, by then, old women who had spent 50 years observing the world from a particular vantage. They had seen, at first hand, what life was like for women without resources, without protection, without options. They had seen, behind the polished surfaces of their own class, the hard arithmetic that determined which women lived comfortably and which did not. They had decided, many of them, that they would use what they had built to soften that arithmetic for as many of those other women as they could. They could not change the world. They could change a small piece of it. They did. The hospitals they funded treated patients of every class. The schools they founded admitted girls from families of modest means. The libraries they endowed were free to anyone who walked in. The homes they built for unmarried mothers gave shelter and dignity to women whom respectable society had cast out. The list of beneficiaries was long. The acknowledgements, in many cases, were modest, even anonymous. The women did not always want their names on buildings. They wanted the buildings to exist. We can stand, for a moment, in one such building, in our composite picture. It is a small library in a neighbourhood of working families, on the edge of a great city in the early 1900s. The library is housed in a modest brick building of 2 stories with a front porch and a small yard. Inside, the main reading room is plain but well kept. There are long oak tables with electric lamps placed at intervals along them. There are wooden chairs, some of them already showing the small marks of frequent use. The walls are lined with shelves, and the shelves are filled with books donated year after year by people in the neighbourhood and by the original endowment of the library itself. The books are mostly in good condition. The librarian, a small precise woman in spectacles, keeps them carefully. The smell of the room is the particular smell of public libraries everywhere. Old paper, beeswax polish on the wooden floors, the faint chemical trace of the ink and the bindings, the lingering scent of coal from the small furnace in the basement. In the late afternoon, this room fills with children. They come from the surrounding tenements and the small wooden houses on the side streets. They sit at the tables. They open books. Some of them are reading well above the level their schools have reached. Some of them are still struggling with the basic shape of letters. The librarian moves quietly among them, helping, suggesting, recommending. She has been here for 15 years. She does not know exactly who funded the library, although she knows there is an endowment that pays her salary, and the cost of the heating and the cost of the books. She has seen, in the original deed of gift, only the name of a charitable trust and the name of a long-deceased lawyer who acted as the original trustee. The actual donor, an old woman who lived 20 miles away in a quiet suburb, who never came to the library in person, who walked in her own garden in her last years and thought sometimes about the children who might be using the books she had bought for them, has been dead now for a decade. She's not commemorated. There is no plaque. There is only the building and the books and the children and the quiet afternoons of reading that, in their accumulated small way, are the gift she actually wanted to give. This was the shape of much of this giving, anonymous, useful, steadily continuing after the donor's death. Not a monument to the donor's name, but a small, ordinary, functioning piece of the world, doing the small, ordinary work it had been designed to do. The women who set up these gifts, in many cases, found this anonymity actively desirable. They had spent their lives operating without recognition, and they had become, by the end, quite practiced at being invisible. The invisibility of their philanthropy was, for them, simply an extension of the invisibility of their other work. The work was the point. The recognition was a distraction. They preferred, on the whole, to do without it. This is the morality, such as it was, of the lady of the house. It was not the morality of the catechism. It was something more rumpled, more practical, more aware of its own contradictions. It was the morality of a person who had learned slowly that the world she lived in was neither as good nor as simple as she had been taught, and that the best she could do, given that, was to act with as much intelligence and as much kindness as she could manage, to keep her own private accounts in order and to use whatever surplus she generated to help somehow the people she could see. If this seems, at the end, a rather forgiving portrait, you may judge for yourself whether the forgiveness is warranted. We are not here, tonight, to render verdicts. We are here to walk slowly through the rooms of a vanished world and to listen to the voices of women who lived in those rooms, and to consider gently what it is to live a life that does not fit cleanly into any single moral frame. These women lived such lives. They are not unique in that. Most lives, looked at closely, do not fit cleanly. The particular shape of the misfit, in their case, is more interesting than most, and that is why we have been walking for so many hours now, through their houses and their gardens and their boudoirs and their morning rooms. There is perhaps something to be said also about the relation between the particular and the general. We have been speaking in these acts of a single composite woman, sometimes called Mrs. Hollister, sometimes Mrs. Vale, sometimes Mrs. Endicott or Mrs. Hargreaves. She is, of course, none of these women, and she is also, in some sense, all of them. She is a useful fiction, a way of carrying forward, in our slow walk through the night, the kinds of patterns and the kinds of details that the actual women of this period, taken collectively, can be seen to have shared. The actual women, individually, were each of them more particular than this composite. Each had her own face, her own voice, her own particular set of gestures, her own particular rooms in her own particular house, in her own particular city. Each was, in the literal sense, irreplaceable. The composite cannot by its nature capture the irreplaceable particularity of any one of them. The composite can only sketch in faint lines the kind of life that many of them, in their separate ways, were leading. This is the limit of any such story. We are talking always about people who are more particular than our talking can possibly convey. The actual lives are, as we have noted, mostly not recoverable. The fragments we have are too few to reconstruct any single woman in full. The composite is what we are left with. The composite is, at least, more accurate than no picture at all. It is also, importantly, less dangerous than a picture that pretended to greater specificity than the evidence supports. We have tried, in this long story, to stay on the right side of that line, to give you a sense of the shape of these lives without claiming knowledge we do not have, to walk you through rooms that resemble the rooms these women lived in, without pretending to walk you through any single particular room that any single particular woman, in any single particular city, would recognize as her own. You can rest in this acknowledgement. The story is not promising you certainties. The story is offering you a kind of slow, careful attentiveness, a way of letting your mind dwell, in the late hours of the night, on a kind of life that was once lived in great quantity by a great many women and that has now mostly faded from view. The dwelling, we hope, is itself a small good thing. It is not the same as knowing. It is the same as remembering in the most general way that there were lives like these, that the lives mattered, and that the women who lived them are, in their slow, accumulated absence, part of what shaped the world we now live in. The fire in the grate has burned low. The light in the room has softened. Outside, the city has settled into its deepest hour, the hour when even the street lamps seem to dim slightly, when the sound of carriages and footsteps almost vanishes from the streets, when only the slow movement of the night watchman and the occasional cry of an infant in a window above breaks the long silence. The lady is asleep in her curtained bed. Her husband, in another room, is also asleep. The house around them is quiet. The great clock in the front hall ticks once, twice, 3 times, 4 times into the dark. You may sleep too now, if you have not already. We will continue. But the loud part of the story is over. From here we walk only through quieter and quieter rooms, and the words themselves will slow, and the voice will lower, and you do not need to follow every turn. You only need to be present gently for as long as you wish, and then to let go when you wish, and to fall into the long good water of sleep. There comes a time, in every long life, when the active management of one's affairs begins, slowly, to be handed over to others. The hands grow less steady, the eyes grow tired, the hours of clear thought become fewer, and the hours of quiet reflection become more. This is true for everyone who lives long enough. It was true for the women of our story. Tonight, in this gentler act, we walk with them into their late years. We do this slowly. The pace of these years is slow. The rhythms are softer. There is no hurry. A woman who had spent 50 years running a household and a network and a parallel set of accounts came, at perhaps 70, to a particular kind of crossroads. She had a successor in mind, usually. She had been training the successor quietly for a decade. The successor was a daughter, or a niece, or a young cousin, or a goddaughter who had shown the right kind of intelligence and discretion. The training had been informal, in long conversations in morning rooms and during walks in gardens and over tea on quiet afternoons. The successor knew, by this point, the names of the principal correspondents. She knew the locations of the books. She knew the lawyer. She knew, if anything happened to the older woman, what to do. The older woman, knowing this, could begin with relief to step back. The stepping back was gradual. First, she would cease to handle the daily correspondence. The daily correspondence would pass to the younger woman, who would bring the letters once a week to the older woman for review. The reviews at first were thorough. Over time they became briefer. Eventually the younger woman simply mentioned, at the end of a quiet visit, the most important developments, and the older woman nodded, and both of them understood that the running of the business had passed. Second, she would begin to delegate the visits. The visits had always been her particular strength. The arrival of a particular caller on a particular afternoon, the conduct of a particular conversation, the careful steering of a particular topic into or out of view had been her art for half a century. As her energy declined, the visits became fewer, and then they began to be conducted by the younger woman in another room. The older woman would still be present in the house. She would still receive certain visitors herself, the oldest friends, the most personal correspondence. The newer business, however, was conducted in the morning room of the younger woman, who was, in many cases by this point, her daughter-in-law or her own daughter living in the same household. Third, she would begin to attend to her own legacy. This was the work of the last years. It was the work of arranging affairs so that, when she died, the structure she'd built would continue or, in some cases, would gracefully wind down. There were legal documents to be redrawn. There were trusts to be closed. There were certain arrangements to be terminated, with appropriate notice and appropriate gestures of thanks to the parties involved. There were charitable bequests to be settled, conditions to be specified, monies to be allocated to causes she had cared about. The lawyer came more often in these years. The visits were quiet. The work was slow and careful. Mistakes at this stage could undo decades of patient construction. Care was paramount. In the household, the staff would notice the changes but would not speak of them. The lady, they would say among themselves in the kitchen, was tired more often these days. The lady was taking longer rests in the afternoon. The lady had begun to spend more time in the garden, when the weather was fine, and more time in the small library when it was not. The lady was not ill exactly. She was simply, as the housekeeper said, slowing. The staff continued to do their work as they had always done it. The household ran as it had always run. The only difference was that the lady, who had once seemed to be everywhere at once, was now, more often, somewhere quiet, in a chair by a window, with a book open on her lap and a shawl around her shoulders, and the sun coming in slantwise across the carpet. The garden in late summer was perhaps her favourite place. The roses had peaked and were fading. The lavender along the path was still in bloom but past its sharpest fragrance. The hollyhocks at the back wall had stretched up to their full height and were leaning slightly. There was a small wooden bench near the fountain. She would sit there in the early afternoon, with her hat shielding her eyes, and she would watch the bees move from flower to flower, and she would think sometimes about her life, and sometimes about nothing at all. The garden had grown with her. She remembered when the apple tree at the back had been a sapling, no taller than her own waist, planted by the gardener in the spring of the year her first child was born. The tree was now larger than the second story of the house. Its branches reached out over the wall into the alley behind. In the autumn it dropped apples into the garden and into the alley alike, and she liked to think of the children of the neighbourhood gathering them up, on the alley side, the way she had gathered windfall apples in her own grandmother's garden as a girl. She had not asked the gardener to prune the tree to keep the apples on her own side. She had let it grow as it wished, and it had taken its own shape, and the shape was a gift to more than just her own household. The bees in the lavender made a steady soft sound, a low warm humming that came up to the bench from her left, and that did not vary, no matter what was happening elsewhere in the world. The bees did not know that there were treaties being signed across the ocean, or that a new president had just been elected, or that the price of cotton had fallen, or that a neighbour's son had just become engaged to a young woman of the wrong family. The bees moved from one purple stem to the next, gathering what they needed, going about their work. She had always found their indifference comforting. It reminded her that the great human concerns were, in the actual scale of the world, smaller than they sometimes seemed. The fountain at her elbow was a small one. It had been her husband's particular pleasure. He had ordered it from a sculptor in Italy, when he had been on his only trip to Europe in middle age, and it had arrived in pieces in the spring of the year after his return, and it had been assembled in the garden by 2 workmen over the course of 3 days. The fountain depicted a small girl pouring water from a jar over a stone basin. The water trickled down continuously, fed by a small pump that the gardener attended to, and the sound of the water was the second steady sound in the garden after the sound of the bees. She liked the fountain. She sometimes thought, with a small wry smile, that the little stone girl pouring water for everyone forever was a kind of inadvertent monument to her own life. The girl never finished her task. The water never ran out. The work continued, generation after generation. She and the stone girl had something in common. In the bed of plants nearest the bench, late roses still held a few blossoms. They were past their best. The petals were slightly crinkled at the edges. The fragrance was no longer the sharp green rose smell of midsummer, but something softer, something with a hint of ripeness in it, almost like a fruit beginning to turn. She liked roses in this stage almost more than in their peak. They were honest. They did not pretend to be at their height. They were past it, and they were beautiful in a different way, and they were teaching her, by being themselves, how to be past her own height with a similar kind of dignity. A blackbird hopped along the path. The cat, an old striped Tom who had lived in the kitchen for years, was nowhere in sight, and the blackbird had taken advantage of the cat's nap to forage for worms in the soft soil between the lavender plants. He pulled one out and shook it and swallowed it and looked around for another. He saw her watching him and did not particularly care. He had known her his whole life. The blackbird had hatched in the apple tree 4 years ago, in a nest that the lady had watched daily through her morning room window during the spring of his first year. He had grown up considering her a fixed and unalarming feature of his territory. She, in turn, considered him a familiar of the household, with the same kind of casual affection she felt for the gardener and the cook and the boy who delivered the milk. These small alliances with the small lives of the garden were, in her late years, more nourishing to her than almost any of the larger relationships of her life had become. The grand visits, the formal dinners, the appearances at charity functions, all of these had grown over time to feel slightly remote, slightly performative. They were still part of her life, and she still attended to them when needed, but they no longer warmed her in the way they once had. The blackbird in the path warmed her. The bees in the lavender warmed her. The fountain trickling at her elbow warmed her. The world had narrowed to a smaller scale, and the smaller scale was, in its own way, more sufficient than the larger scale had ever been. The thinking, when it came, was not the urgent thinking of younger years. It was a slower, more sifting kind of thought. She remembered often very early scenes, a particular afternoon in her childhood when she had walked in a wood with her father, a particular evening at her grandmother's house when she had been allowed to sit at the dinner table with the adults for the first time, a particular morning in her first year of marriage when she had stood at the window of the breakfast room and looked at the new yellow leaves of the maple tree on the corner, and had felt with a clarity that surprised her that she was now finally an adult, that the long apprenticeship of being a girl was over, and that the work of her own life had begun. These memories in the late years took on a strange soft texture. They were not exactly painful. They were also not exactly sweet. They were something in between, something like the texture of a piece of cloth that has been washed and folded many times and still carries faintly the scent of where it had once been. She held them in her mind, and she let them go, and they returned, and she let them go again. There were, of course, some memories she did not let return easily. There were certain decisions taken decades earlier that had cost certain people more than she had at the time wished to acknowledge. There were certain arrangements that had ended indirectly in the loss of a particular family's livelihood. There were certain shipments that had carried, in retrospect, more weight of consequence than she had at the time understood. These memories did come back sometimes in the still afternoons of the garden. She did not turn away from them. She let them sit beside her, on the bench, and she looked at them, and she did not pretend they were other than what they were. She had done what she had done. She had done it for reasons that had seemed sufficient at the time. She had done it, in many cases, with as much care as the circumstances allowed. She had not always done it well. She knew this. She accepted it. The acceptance was part of what allowed her now to sit quietly and watch the bees. In some cases, in these late years, she made amends, not always publicly. Sometimes she wrote a private letter to a person whose family had been hurt long ago, expressing, in careful and unspecific terms, an awareness and a regret, and enclosing a sum of money that would, she hoped, make some small difference. The recipient did not always understand the letter. The recipient sometimes took the money and never thought about the letter again. The lady considered, in her own ledger, that the debt was now, as far as she could manage, addressed. It was not paid in full. Some debts cannot be paid in full, but it was acknowledged, and the acknowledgement was a kind of payment in its own right. The body in these late years asked for new attentions. She woke earlier than she had ever woken in her younger years. The light at 5 in the morning was, at certain seasons, a clean, pale silver light, neither warm nor cold, lying in long slants across the bedroom floor. She would lie still for a few minutes, listening to the quiet of the house, listening to her own breathing, registering the small, persistent ache in her left hip, and the small, persistent stiffness in her hands, and the small, persistent slowness in her thoughts that meant her body was, today as yesterday, still her body, still old, still working, still hers. She would, after a while, sit up slowly on the edge of the bed. She would put her feet into the slippers her maid had set out the night before. She would stand slowly holding the bedpost for a moment until the small dizziness passed. Then she would walk, slowly, to the window, and she would draw aside one panel of the curtain and she would look out at the morning street where the lamps were still lit and the milkman's cart was just turning the corner with its small steady rattle of bottles. These mornings had a particular quality. She was, she sometimes thought, more honest at this hour than at any other hour of the day. The performances of the day had not yet begun. The clothes had not yet been put on. The face had not yet been arranged. She was, in the early light at the window, simply herself, an old woman in a nightgown, looking out at a street where the new day was beginning, considering what the day might bring, and what she might need from it, and what she might be able to give to it. The honesty of these mornings had become over time precious to her. She did not always wish to give them up. Sometimes she stood at the window for a quarter of an hour or more, watching the city turn from night to day before she rang for her maid, and the day's small ceremonies began. The small ceremonies were many. The dressing took longer than it once had. Her maid, a woman of nearly her own age now, had been with her for 30 years. The two of them moved through the morning routine together with the slow, practiced ease of two people who have done a particular sequence of tasks together so many times that words are no longer required. The corset, which she had worn as a young woman, had long since been replaced by a softer kind of support. The hair, which had been thick and dark, was now thin and silver, and was arranged simply in a low knot at the back of her neck with a single ornament at the base. The face cream, which had once been a vanity, was now a kindness, soothing the small dry tightness of skin that had seen too many winters. The dress, which had once been chosen with attention to the season's fashion, was now chosen with attention to the day's small comforts and the day's small expected encounters. She came down to breakfast in a small back morning room that overlooked the garden. She no longer used the formal dining room for breakfast. The formal dining room was kept now for guests, and there were not many guests at breakfast in her late years. She sat alone, or with her husband when he was well enough to come down, at a small round table by the window. She drank weak tea with milk. She ate a small piece of toast with a thin layer of butter and one half of a soft-boiled egg. She read, while she ate, certain favoured passages from a small book of poems she had loved since her 30s, or a few pages of a recent novel that her daughter-in-law had recommended. She did not read the newspaper at breakfast. The newspaper she read later, in the small library, after the day was a little more advanced. The household, in the meanwhile, ran around her. The cook in the basement was preparing the day's meals. The kitchen maid was scrubbing the front steps. The housekeeper was reviewing the linen with the laundress in the back hall. The under-butler was polishing the silver in the pantry. The gardener was already at work in the garden, tying up the late tomatoes, raking the gravel paths, gathering the windfall apples. The boy who came to clean the boots had come and gone before she was even awake. The footman, who would later attend her on her drive, was, at this hour, eating his own breakfast at the long table in the servants' hall. The household, in its many small parts, was a small living organism, and she was its slow, mild head, and the head in its old age did not need to direct the body very actively. The body had been trained, over decades, to do its work without close supervision. It did its work. It would have done its work even if the head had been absent for a week. The discipline of the household, like the discipline of the larger enterprise, had become self-perpetuating, and she could, with quiet relief, allow it to perpetuate itself. After breakfast she would, on most days, retire to the small library, which was her private room. The library was a long, narrow room on the first floor, with a window onto the garden at one end and a window onto the side street at the other. The walls were lined with books that she had collected over 40 years. They were not the kind of books that decorate a public library. They were books she had actually read, and many of them she had read more than once, and some of them were marked, in pencil, with small comments in her own hand that no one but she would ever read or fully understand. There was a desk under the side street window, with an inkstand on it, and a blotter, and a small framed photograph of her mother. There was a deep armchair near the fire with a small footstool in front of it, and a small round table beside it on which a book and a cup of tea and a pair of reading spectacles were generally to be found. In this room she did, in her late years, most of the writing that mattered. The letters to her granddaughters at school, the letters to old friends in distant cities, the letters to the lawyer about the trusts and the bequests, the notes to herself on small loose sheets of paper that she would later destroy. The room was warm in winter, it was cool in summer. It smelled of book leather and pencil shavings, and the small bunch of dried lavender she kept in a saucer on the desk. It was by a wide margin the room in the house she loved most. If she could, she sometimes thought, she would die in this room. She would not, in fact, die in this room. She would die in her bed, with the dawn beginning outside her bedroom window. But on quiet afternoons in her late years, sitting in the deep armchair by the fire, with the rain falling softly against the windows and the light from the lamp warm on the page of her book, she felt sometimes that this small room was the truest dwelling place of her life, and that everything else, every grand parlour, every drawing room, every ballroom of her younger years, had been a kind of necessary scaffolding around this small final inner room, where she was at last simply herself. She thought, also, in these years, about her own death. She did not fear it particularly. She had been raised in a tradition that taught her death was a passage rather than an ending, and the teaching, although she'd questioned it in middle age, had returned to her in late age with a softer authority. She thought of her father. She thought of her mother. She thought of friends who had gone before her. She did not believe she would meet them exactly, in the way the simpler versions of her religion had described. She believed more that she would join something larger, something quieter, something into which all the loud particularities of a life were eventually folded and resolved. She did not know how to describe this belief to anyone, and she had stopped trying. It was enough that she had it. It comforted her. It allowed her to think about the eventual hour of her own ending, without the kind of panic that had occasionally seized her at 50. The household in the meanwhile continued. The young woman who would inherit the active part of the work was already at work. The older woman watched her with quiet pride and occasional mild concern, and offered advice when asked, and refrained from offering advice when not. The younger woman made some mistakes, as anyone in such a position would. The mistakes were absorbed, the work continued, the lessons accumulated. By the time the older woman died, which she did, in our story, peacefully, in her own bed, in the early hours of an autumn morning with her daughter and her doctor and her old maid present, the transition had already long since happened, and the structures she had built carried on without breaking step. Before that morning came, however, there had been the long, careful work of the lawyer's visits. The lawyer was a man she had known for almost 40 years. He had been a young clerk in his own father's firm when she had first engaged the firm in her early married life. He had grown, over the decades, into the senior partner. He was, by the time of our story, himself a man in his late 60s, white-haired, slightly stooped, with the patient, courteous manner of someone who has spent his life being trusted with other people's secrets. He came to the house in her late years more often than he had ever come before. He always came in the morning. He brought, in a leather case, the documents he wanted her to review. They sat together in her small library. They went through the documents slowly, page by page. She made small marks, in pencil, where she wanted changes. He took notes. He returned, the following week or the week after, with the changes incorporated, and the process began again. The work was not merely the preparation of her will. The will was, in fact, a small part of it. The larger part was the slow disassembly and reassembly of the various structures she had built over decades. Certain trusts needed to be closed before her death, with their assets distributed to the parties she wished to benefit, in order to avoid certain inheritance complications later. Certain trusts needed to be reorganized, with new trustees appointed, in order to ensure that the structures would continue to function under the new arrangements. Certain accounts needed to be quietly closed. Certain payments to certain parties needed to be terminated, with appropriate small final gifts of thanks. Certain properties needed to be transferred while she was still alive to the person she wished to receive them, in a manner that would not attract undue attention later. Each of these tasks required careful thought. Each required careful drafting, each required careful execution. The lawyer understood by long practice exactly how careful she wished him to be. He did not ask questions about the underlying purposes of the various structures. He did not need to ask. He had been the firm's senior partner for nearly 2 decades, and he had handled in that time the closing affairs of many ladies of her generation, and he had developed a quiet professional sense for the kinds of tasks that were being performed and the kinds of discretion that were required. He performed his work. He charged his fees, which were not small but which were entirely reasonable. He delivered the finished documents. He filed the necessary papers in the necessary courts. He kept, in a particular locked drawer in his own private office, certain files that would, after his own retirement, be passed only to his named successor at the firm, who would understand, as he had understood, that they were not under any circumstances to be disclosed. She paid him, on his last visit before her final illness, a particular small additional fee in cash, in an envelope that she handed to him as he was leaving. He received the envelope without opening it. He nodded once. He thanked her. He left. The fee was for the additional discretion she had required of him over the years, beyond what his ordinary professional fees had covered. He would, after her death, review the contents of the envelope, and he would find inside it not money but a small handwritten note, which read simply, "With thanks for everything you have not asked," and which was signed with her initials. He would keep the note for the rest of his own life in a small private file in his own desk, and after his death his successor would find it, and would not know exactly what it referred to, but would understand in a general way what kind of relationship it documented, and would treat the note with the appropriate quiet respect, and would, in due course, place it among the firm's archives, where it sits perhaps, even now, in a folder that no one has opened in many years. In the very last weeks, when she could no longer come down to the small library, the lawyer came up to her bedroom. He sat in a chair drawn up beside the bed. He read aloud in a quiet, steady voice the final versions of the documents that needed her last signatures. She listened. She nodded at the appropriate places. She signed when signing was required, with a hand that had by then grown thin and slightly trembling, but whose signature was still recognisably her signature, the same signature she had used since she was a young woman of 18 taking her first place on the family's accounts. The lawyer countersigned where his countersignature was required. A witness, brought in from the household for the moment, added a third signature. The witness, who was the housekeeper, did not read the documents, did not ask about them, and signed where she was asked to sign with the air of someone who had been through this kind of small private ceremony before in her career, and who knew, by long experience, that her signature was being given to attest only to the lady's identity and the lady's apparent state of mind, both of which she could honestly confirm. When the documents were done, the lawyer gathered them, returned them to his leather case, took the lady's hand for a brief moment, said a few words she did not entirely catch but whose tone she understood, and left. She lay in her bed afterward, looking at the ceiling, and she thought with a small clear satisfaction that the work was now, as far as she could arrange it, complete. The structures would continue. The persons she wished to benefit would benefit. The persons she wished to release would be released. The arrangements were as orderly as a lifetime of attention could make them. She could now, she felt, allow her mind to release the work entirely, and to turn, in its remaining hours, to whatever else it wished to attend to. Her funeral was a large one by the standards of her city. She had been known, she had been respected. She had given publicly to many causes, and the recipients of those gifts came to pay their respects. The newspapers wrote a column about her. The column was conventional. It described her as a great lady of her era. It described her charitable works. It listed her surviving family. It said nothing, of course, about the other half of her life, because the other half had been kept invisible, and she had wanted it that way, and the wish had been honoured, and the secret had passed, intact, to the women who had been entrusted to keep it. The grave is in a cemetery on a hill outside the city. The stone is a simple one. Her name is on it, with the dates. There is no quotation. There is no elaborate angel. There is, beside the stone, a smaller stone for her husband, who had predeceased her by several years. There is, at the base of both stones, a small bed of plants that the family pays to have tended. The plants are humble ones, ferns and ivies, and a few small spring flowers. They suit her. She would have approved. Twice a year, on her birthday and on the anniversary of her death, the younger woman comes to the cemetery alone. She brings a small bunch of white flowers. She places the flowers at the foot of the stone. She stands for a few minutes. She does not speak. She thinks perhaps about the older woman and about the long apprenticeship she received from her, and about the work she is now doing in her place, and about the next young woman to whom she will, in her own time, pass everything on. The wind moves the trees overhead. A few leaves fall. She turns and walks back to the gate. This is how these lives ended. Not with great public reckonings, not with newspaper exposés, not with court trials and ruined names, with slow, quiet, careful transitions, conducted by women who had been trained from girlhood in exactly that kind of slow, quiet, careful work. The structures continued, the names changed, the fortunes adjusted slightly with each generation. The world above noticed nothing. You can rest in this now. The story is winding down. The lights in the cemetery are very gentle. The wind is soft. The autumn afternoon is mild. You do not need to remember any of the particulars. You do not need to keep track of the names. You only need to feel beneath all of the words the slow, settled rhythm of long lives ending well, and of new lives beginning, and of the long, mostly quiet, mostly ordinary, mostly human business of one generation handing on to the next whatever it is that, in their own particular case, must be handed on. We're nearing the end of our story. The hour is late. The fire in the grate has burned down to a soft orange glow. The candles are guttering. Outside, the city has fallen into its deepest sleep. Tonight, in this gentler chapter, we want to speak very softly about what these women carried with them through their lives. Not the goods they moved, not the money they accumulated. Something else. Something that is harder to name. The inner weight of it. The thing they knew that no one else knew, and the thing they could not have said even if they had wished to. A perfect socialite who is also secretly the manager of an enterprise her husband knows nothing about, lives, every day, with a particular kind of doubleness. The doubleness is not the same as ordinary privacy. Everyone has private thoughts. Everyone has small interior life that does not show on the surface. The doubleness we are speaking of is larger. It is the carrying, every hour, of a self that the world around her has not been allowed to see. It is the daily work of presenting to one's husband, one's children, one's friends, one's servants, one's neighbours, one's clergymen, a self that is real but partial. The other part is sealed inside. It does not, in most cases, leak. It is held with such discipline that it might as well not exist except that it does, and the woman who is holding it knows that it does, and the holding takes a certain kind of energy that never quite stops being expended. Some women bore this doubleness well. They had a certain temperament for it. They were the kind of people who, even as small girls, had liked having secrets. They had liked the feeling of knowing something the other children did not know. They had liked the small, steady hum of inner privacy. As adults, they expanded the privacy. The bigger privacy felt, in some ways, like a more elaborate version of the smaller one, and they were good at it, and they took in some quiet corner of themselves a certain pleasure in being good at it. Other women bore it less easily. The doubleness wore at them. There were, in certain women's diaries that have survived from this period, occasional entries that hint at exhaustion. The woman writes that she is tired, that she has been pretending all day, that she wishes she could lay down some weight she does not name. The diaries are usually careful, even in private. The women had learned deeply never to write down anything that could be used against them. So the entries about tiredness do not specify what the tiredness is from. But the tiredness is there, on the page, in faint pencil, in a hand that has perhaps grown a little less neat than usual, and the modern reader, looking at the entry, can guess at what it cost her to write even that much. We can imagine one such woman on one such night. She is in her bedroom. The hour is past 11. The household has gone to bed. Her maid has been dismissed. She's alone, for the first time since early morning. She sits in the small chair by her dressing table. She has taken off her dinner gown and is in her dressing gown of soft, pale grey wool. Her hair has been let down. It hangs over her shoulders, longer than anyone outside the household has seen it in 20 years. Her face, in the mirror across from her, is the face she does not show in public. The face she shows in public has a particular small composure to it, a particular small lifting at the corners of the mouth, a particular small alertness of the eyes. The face in the mirror late at night has none of that. It is simply the face of a tired woman in middle age, in soft light, with the small involuntary lines of fatigue settling around her eyes and her mouth. She picks up the small leather diary on the table. She takes the small pencil from its loop. She opens to the next blank page. She writes the date. She writes, in a hand that is, indeed, slightly less neat than her hand of the morning, a single line. Today has been long. She closes the diary. She puts the pencil back in its loop. She places the diary in the small drawer of the dressing table where it lives, and she turns the small key in the small lock, and she puts the small key in the small velvet bag in which she keeps a few similar small keys. She has written what she needed to write. The single line is enough. It is, in its way, a complete entry. It records, for her own future reference, that on this particular date she was tired in a particular way, and the tiredness, having been recorded, can now, with a small relief, be released. She rises from the chair. She walks slowly to the bed. She slides between the cool sheets. She arranges her hair in the careful way she has arranged it for sleep for 40 years, so that it will not tangle in the night. She lies on her back. She breathes. She listens to the small sounds of the house settling, the tick of the clock on the landing, the faint creak of a floorboard in the room above, the wind in the trees of the street outside. She thinks, briefly, of nothing in particular. She thinks briefly of the day's small concerns. She thinks briefly of the larger long concerns of her life. And then she does not think. She drifts slowly into the long good sleep that the body grants. Eventually, even to women who carry in their waking hours the kind of weight she carries, sleep is impartial. Sleep does not ask, before granting itself, whether the person seeking it has been honest with the world during the day. Sleep simply comes, at last, when the body asks for it patiently enough, and the body now has asked, and sleep has answered, and the room is quiet, and the woman is at rest. The women who struggled most with the doubleness were often by all accounts the most devout. They had been raised in a faith that took seriously the question of inner truth. They had been taught that the soul was supposed to be unified, that the inner life and the outer life ought to match, that hypocrisy of any sort was a particular kind of sin. They had grown up reciting the words of the Sermon on the Mount, in which the speaker insisted with great force on the importance of being one thing, all the way through, on integrity in the literal sense of being integrated, of having no separate sealed compartments inside oneself. A woman who had been trained in this teaching, and who then, by the circumstances of her life, found herself running a sealed compartment inside herself for 40 years, was a woman who carried a particular kind of theological burden. She did not always speak about it. She did not always know how to speak about it, but she carried it. It accompanied her into church on Sunday mornings. It accompanied her to the altar at Easter. It sat with her in the long, quiet hours of private prayer. She did not always come to a satisfactory peace with it. Some women, in the late years, did. Some did not. The ones who did not, generally, did not write much about it. The ones who did, sometimes, in the very last years, wrote a few cautious sentences in private notebooks, sentences that suggest they had worked their way to a kind of acceptance, an acceptance that was not the same as innocence, but was, in their own minds, a kind of completed account. There was also the carrying of all the things they knew about other people. A woman who spent 50 years at the centre of a great social network, listening, watching, remembering, accumulated a vast store of knowledge about her neighbours and friends and acquaintances. She knew which marriages were affectionate and which were arrangements. She knew which families had hidden tragedies. She knew which fortunes were quietly being lost. She knew which children, behind the surface of their good clothes and their careful manners, were suffering. She knew about deaths that had been described as illnesses but had been something else. She knew about births that were, in the official records, the children of one set of parents and were, in private fact, the children of another. She knew sometimes the precise details of love affairs, of debts, of betrayals, of small, ordinary cruelties. She did not, in most cases, use any of this knowledge against anyone. The discretion that ran her own enterprise also ran her treatment of other people's secrets. She kept what she knew. She did not share it. She did not, in private, gloat over it. She treated it as part of the cost of being who she was, the price of having the position from which she conducted her own business. The knowledge accumulated over the years into a vast inner library, almost none of which she ever opened to anyone else, and which she would, in due course, take with her to the grave. There were occasionally small kindnesses she did with this knowledge. A young woman, the daughter of a friend who was about to make what the lady knew, from 100 small accumulated observations, would be a difficult marriage to a man whose family had certain hidden pressures upon them, would receive from the lady a gentle invitation to come to tea privately, just the two of them, and during the tea the lady would, with the most careful indirection, mention certain considerations the young woman might find useful, and the young woman would in some cases hear the warning beneath the indirection, and the marriage would be reconsidered, and the young woman would 10 years later send the lady a Christmas card with a note expressing a particular kind of warmth that the lady understood and that the young woman's husband, whoever he was, did not. These small interventions were rare. The lady did not interfere often. She did not consider it her place. But on certain occasions she did, and the small good that came of it was, in her own private accounting, a small reduction in the larger debit of her inner ledger. There were also small mercies she withheld. A particular man, a member of her social circle, was conducting an affair with a particular woman, and the lady, by the standard channels of her inner library, knew it. The man's wife was a woman the lady knew slightly, not well enough to consider a friend, but well enough to feel a small sympathy for. The lady considered at one point telling the wife. She considered it carefully over the course of several weeks. In the end, she did not tell. She decided on balance that the wife had not asked, that the wife seemed by all evidence to be living a life she found acceptable, that the disruption of telling would cause more harm than the silence, and that it was not, in the end, her place to deliver knowledge that had not been requested. She kept the silence. The marriage continued. The wife, in due course, died not knowing, and the husband, after the wife's death, married the woman he'd loved more, and the lady, when she heard the news, felt a complicated, brief feeling that she did not fully analyse, and she let it go. The inner library held the case, with its annotations, and the case sat there undisturbed for the rest of her life. The library was not an archive of cynicism. It was more often an archive of compassion. She had seen, by her late years, so many marriages and so many families and so many private struggles that she had come to understand, with a kind of practical tenderness, how hard it was for human beings to live well with each other under the conditions her world provided. The men she knew were, by her assessment, mostly trying. The women she knew were, by her assessment, mostly trying. They were doing their work as well as they could in a system whose rules were not of their making. Her inner library, full of their secret failures and their secret kindnesses, made her over time less inclined to judgment than she had been as a younger woman. She had become, by her late years, a person who, when she heard a piece of new gossip, did not laugh, and did not exclaim and did not pass the gossip on, but instead listened quietly, asked one or two careful questions, and, having ascertained the truth of the matter, simply added it to the library and let the matter rest. This was, perhaps, the loneliest part of her life. She knew so much about so many people, and they knew so little about her. The asymmetry was structural. It was the necessary asymmetry of her work. But it had a personal cost that we should, at this late hour, name. She was, in a sense, intimately acquainted with the inner workings of dozens or hundreds of households, and she was almost completely unknown, in her own inner workings, to anyone in any of them. She was the great observer of her circle, and she was also almost entirely unobserved. There were a few people who came close to seeing her. A particular old friend, sometimes, with whom she'd known since childhood, and with whom she could speak more freely than with anyone else. A particular maid, in one or two cases, who had been with her for so many decades that the maid had absorbed by sheer proximity some understanding of what was happening. A particular sister, in some cases, with whom there had been, in girlhood, a closeness that survived into old age, and that allowed certain conversations no one else could have been part of. These few witnesses were precious. The women who had them were, on the whole, the ones who carried the doubleness most easily. The women who did not have them were the ones who, at 3 a.m, on certain difficult nights, felt a loneliness that nothing in their respectable surroundings could quite assuage. We can imagine gently one such witness, an old friend, the same age as the lady, who had grown up 2 streets away from her in the same city, in the 1840s or 50s. The 2 girls had played together as children. They had attended the same dancing school. They had made their debuts in the same season. They had married, in the end, men who knew each other slightly. Their houses in adulthood were a few miles apart, and they had visited each other every other Wednesday for 40 years, without missing more than a handful of these visits in all that time. The visits were brief, usually no more than an hour. They were conducted in one or another of the friends' small sitting rooms. Tea was served. The conversation was, on the surface, ordinary. Family news, books, the garden, the weather, the small frets of running households of a particular size in a particular kind of neighbourhood. Beneath the surface, however, the conversations were something else. The friend knew, in a general way, what the lady was actually doing with her life. The lady had, over the years, mentioned things in passing that, to anyone less close, would have been mere asides, but that to the friend conveyed the essential outlines of the truth. The friend had not asked for details. She had not wanted the burden of details. She had been content instead simply to know, in general, that her friend was a more complicated person than the world supposed, and to offer, by her presence, a place where her friend could exist, briefly, every other Wednesday, as the more complicated person she actually was, before returning, an hour later, to the simpler version that the rest of her life required. These visits were a kind of small chamber of quiet honesty in an otherwise carefully managed life. They were for the lady a relief beyond easy description. She did not during them reveal anything specific. She did not during them conduct any business. She simply sat with another woman who knew, in the way that mattered, who she was, and she drank her tea, and she watched her friend pour out a second cup, and she felt, for that hour, the small nourishment of being seen. After the hour, she would gather her gloves and her bag, kiss her friend lightly on the cheek, step into the carriage that was waiting at the door, and ride home through the streets of the city, restored, by a degree she could not always have measured, to the rest of her week. When this friend died, in the lady's late 60s, the loss was profound. The lady did not at the funeral weep visibly. She sat in the appropriate pew, and she stood at the appropriate moments, and she shook the appropriate hands afterward, and she said the appropriate things. She rode home in her carriage, alone. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom. She lay down on the bed in her clothes. She wept then, for half an hour, into the pillow, with the kind of crying that does not make any noise, the kind that simply moves like a slow tide through a body that has held something in for a very long time. After half an hour she got up. She washed her face. She came down to dinner. She did not speak of the friend's death for the rest of that evening, except to acknowledge the formal condolences of her husband, who did not, of course, understand what had actually been lost. She was never after the friend's death quite as easy in herself as she had been before. She had no other friend of that depth. She had relations and acquaintances and church associates and women she saw at charitable boards. She had no other person in the world who knew, in the general way that mattered, who she was. The doubleness, after the loss, became heavier. She bore it. She had been bearing it for decades. She was practiced at bearing it. But it was heavier than it had been, and the small extra weight stayed with her until the end of her life, and it was, in some ways, a kind of permanent companion of her last 15 years. And she came, eventually, to a peace with it, the way one comes to a peace with a chronic small ailment, by accepting it as part of who one now was. There were also the maids and the housekeepers, a few of whom, over the decades, had become something more than servants. There was, in particular, in our composite, a woman named Bridget, who had come into the ladies' service as a housemaid at the age of 17, fresh from County Cork, with very little English and a fierce shy intelligence. The lady had recognised the intelligence. She had, over time, promoted Bridget through the ranks of the household. By the time both women were in their 40s, Bridget was the housekeeper. By the time both women were in their 60s, Bridget was, in everything but title, the lady's closest daily companion in the house. They did not on either side presume to think of each other as friends. The class line between them was real and was respected, but they understood each other, by long observation, more thoroughly than almost anyone else in either of their lives understood them. Bridget knew, in the way that long-serving senior servants know, what was happening in the morning room. She did not know the details of the business. She had not been told, and she had not asked. She knew the outlines. She knew which visitors mattered and which did not. She knew which letters required particular care and which were ordinary. She knew where certain papers were kept, and she knew which drawers were never to be entered without specific permission, and she knew, on certain occasions, how to recognise a moment when the lady needed not the housekeeper but, briefly, simply another human being in the room. On those occasions, Bridget would bring tea unbidden. She would set it down on the small table by the lady's chair. She would say something brief and unimportant about the weather, or about the cook's plan for dinner. She would withdraw. The lady, sitting alone again in the room, would drink the tea, and she would feel, in the act of having been brought it without having asked, a small warm thread of being known. She would not have called it friendship. She would have called it something else, something for which the language of her class did not provide a name, but it nourished her. It was part of how she got through the work. When Bridget died, before the lady, of pneumonia in her 68th year, the lady attended the funeral, which was held in a small Catholic church in a poor neighbourhood of the city. She was almost the only person there from her own class. She sat at the back. She did not take communion because she was not a Catholic. She prayed, in her own way, for Bridget. She spoke briefly afterward to Bridget's brother, who had come from County Cork for the funeral, and she gave him a sealed envelope with a sum of money inside it, larger than the brother had ever held in his life, and she told him it was for Bridget's surviving relatives, and she asked him not to say where it had come from. He did not say. He took the envelope. The money supported a niece of Bridget's through nursing school 10 years later, in a city the lady had never visited. The lady never knew this. The line of the gift, like so many of her gifts, ran out of her sight into lives she would not see, doing work she had hoped it would do and trusting the work to continue without her supervision, and the trust was, in the end, well placed. What they knew, taken altogether, was a kind of secret history of their cities and their era. The published history of the Gilded Age is the history of railroads and steel mills, of the men whose names are on the buildings, of the politicians and the financiers and the tycoons. The unpublished history, the history that lived in the heads of the women in the parlours, is a different history. It is the history of how marriages actually worked behind their public faces. It is the history of which families were rising for reasons that were entirely respectable, and which were rising for reasons that were not. It is the history of how money actually moved, in the small private ways, alongside the large public ways. It is the history of who was kind and who was cruel, of who was honest and who was performing honesty, of who was, in their own home, the person they presented to the world and who was something else. This history is mostly lost. The women who carried it died with it, mostly. A few fragments survive in letters, in diaries, in the occasional anecdote handed down within a family. Most of it is gone. Historians sometimes wish they had it. They would understand the period much more deeply if they did. They will, on the whole, never have it. The women were too good at their work. The records they left behind are exactly the records they wanted to leave behind and no others. We can sit for a moment with this loss. It is, in its own way, one of the great quiet losses of the historical record. It is not a loss that lends itself to dramatic mourning, the way the loss of a great library or a great archive does. It is a loss of a different kind, a loss of a kind that has, by its own design, been arranged to be unmournable, because the people who arranged it did not wish to be mourned, did not wish to be studied, did not wish to be reconstructed. They wished instead to be allowed to fade. They wished the structure they had built to continue without their names attached to it, and they wished their personal lives in the end to disappear with them, and the wish has been, on the whole, granted. There is a kind of dignity in this. We may not approve of every choice these women made. We may on closer reflection find some of their choices troubling, but we can grant them this, that they understood, with great clarity, what they wanted to leave to the future and what they wanted to keep for themselves, and they arranged their lives and their deaths accordingly. They did not seek the immortality that comes from being recorded. They preferred the quieter immortality of having simply done what they did, and of having done it well, and of having allowed the doing to be its own reward. This is, in some ways, the deepest difference between them and the men of their era. The men, by and large, wanted to be known. They wanted their names on the buildings. They wanted their portraits in the histories. They wanted the future to look back at them and say, "Here, this was a great man. This was a builder of nations. This was a maker of the modern world." The women, by and large, did not want this. They wanted, on the whole, to do their work and to disappear. The disappearance was, for them, not a failure but an accomplishment. It was a sign that they had done their work well, that they had not been caught, that they had not been studied, that they had been allowed to live and to die in the kind of privacy their position made both possible and necessary. And so we have, today, the buildings the men built, with the men's names on them, and we have the histories of the men's work written largely by other men, and we have a relatively detailed picture of what it was like, in this era, to be a railroad baron or a steel magnate or a financier. We do not have, in the same kind of detail, what it was like to be the woman in the parlour, who was, in her own way, also building something, also moving money, also shaping the world she lived in. We have only the outlines, we have only the gaps in the records, the silhouettes against the light, the shape of an absence that was carefully maintained. This loss has, in recent decades, become a kind of project for certain historians. They go looking for the women. They find what they can. They write the books they can write. The books are good, and they are necessary, and they have begun to fill in some of the gaps. But the books also acknowledge honestly that the gaps will never be entirely filled. The women were, in their lifetimes, very thorough. The women, in their dying, were very thorough as well. The closure of their archives was as careful, in many cases, as the management of their living enterprises had been. The result is a historical record with a particular kind of permanent shadow at its edge, a shadow within which a great deal of human life took place, and from which only fragments occasionally drift out into the light. There is a strange kind of dignity in this when you think about it. They controlled, in death as in life, the version of themselves that survived. They decided what would be known about them. They decided what would not be known. They had, in this respect, more authority over their own posthumous reputations than almost any of the men of their era, who left enormous paper trails and whose private lives have been in many cases exposed by historians a century later. The women left less. The less they left was deliberately less. The privacy of their inner enterprises, both legitimate and otherwise, has in most cases been preserved. This was their final act of management. They managed their own absence, they arranged it, the way they had arranged dinners and ballrooms and shipments and trusts. They designed it, they executed it, and the design in most cases has held. You may rest in this thought, if it suits you. The women are by now well beyond the reach of any reckoning. They have arranged matters so that their lives are mostly closed to inspection, and the world they shaped continues without them, in the small accumulated effects of their many small choices, in the institutions they funded, in the families they raised, in the careful, slow continuities they passed on to those who came after. They are in this sense present in our own world still, though we cannot see them. They are in this sense with us tonight, in a quiet way, as we walk through the rooms of their vanished houses and listen to the small sounds their lives made, and let those sounds, like all the other sounds of the night, slowly fade into the long, deep stillness of the very late hour, in which all sounds are eventually absorbed and all stories are eventually concluded. The fire in our long story has burned almost out. Only a few coals remain in the grate, glowing dim red in the dark. The room is very quiet. The clock in the hall has just struck 3. There is no one moving in the house. The streets outside are empty. The stars overhead have wheeled to their late positions, and a thin band of pale, lightening sky hints at a very distant dawn that has not yet quite begun. We are at the end of the long night. You can rest now. There is nothing left to follow. The women in our story have by now all entered the soft archive of their own carefully designed silence. They are not visible to us anymore. Their portraits hang in family parlours of descendants who do not know what to make of them. Their houses in many cases have been torn down. Their gardens have been built over. Their carriage horses are long since gone. The world they inhabited has dissolved into the world we now inhabit, the way one season dissolves into the next, by imperceptible gradations, until one day we look around and the old season is no longer present, not even as a memory, only as a kind of softening of the air, a taste of something past, a faint fragrance of orange blossom and bergamot drifting in from somewhere we cannot quite locate. The hour is now very late. The candles, which have guttered for some time, have at last gone out one by one. The fire is no longer a fire. It is only a few last small red points in a bed of ash, and even those are fading, and the warmth in the grate is now only the faint memory of warmth, the kind of warmth that you sense more by its absence than by its presence. The room is dim. The shadows have come up around the edges. The walls, which earlier in the evening had been visible in their full pattern of paper and frame and small painting, are now only suggestions, soft shapes dissolving into the dark. Outside the window, the city is at its lowest tide. Even the night watchman has perhaps sat down on a bench at the corner of his beat to rest for a few minutes. Even the cats in the alleys have curled themselves into the small warm hollows they have found behind kitchen doors. Even the horses in the stables down the street, which earlier shifted and snorted in their stalls, have settled into their long, deep equine sleep, breathing slowly, their large bodies still under the soft warm covering of their stable blankets. The whole city is, at this hour, very nearly motionless. It is the kind of motionlessness that comes only once a night, and that lasts only for an hour or so, and that gives way, eventually, to the very first stirrings of the day to come, but not yet. Not yet. Not for a long, quiet while yet. In the houses we have walked through, in the parlours and the morning rooms and the gardens and the small libraries, The same motionlessness has settled. The lamps have been turned down. The clocks have ticked through the deepest part of the night. The women, those who are still living in our story, are asleep in their curtained beds. Those who have already died are at rest in their cemeteries on the gentle hills outside the cities, with the small humble plants growing at the foot of their stones, and the leaves of the trees overhead moving in whatever small wind the night has provided. There is nothing further to attend to. The story is complete. The structures continue without us. The work has been done, and the work continues, and the work will continue in its long, quiet way, long after this particular night has ended, and many other nights have come and gone in their turn. You can release everything now. There is nothing left for you to follow. There is nothing left for you to remember. There is nothing left for you to hold. The women have managed their own absences. They have arranged their own quiet endings. They have left, for those who came after, exactly as much and as little as they wished to leave. You have been their guest for these few hours, in the rooms of their imagined houses. They have, in their composite way, received you with the same calm courtesy with which they received the actual guests of their actual lives. You have been offered tea. You have been offered a chair by the fire. You have been allowed to sit in the soft light and to listen, for a long quiet time, to the small sounds of a world that has now ended. And now the visit is over. The house is dark. The doors will close softly behind you. You can step out into the long, good water of sleep. The water will hold you. The night will hold you. There is nothing else now that needs to be done. The kitchen is still. The radio has gone silent. A single light is left on in the hall, low and warm, casting a soft circle of amber on the wooden floor. The cup on the table by the chair has long since cooled. The book that someone was reading has slid down to the edge of the cushion and is balanced there, half open, the pages no longer being turned. The clock ticks once into the quiet, and then once again, and the sound is soft, a sound from another time, a sound that does not insist. Outside, the city has sunk into its lowest hour. The wind has dropped. A single late carriage passes somewhere far off. The wheels a faint murmur, the horse's hooves a small distant rhythm, then it is gone, and there is only the long soft hush of a sleeping street under a sky that is just beginning, in its very deepest layer, to think about turning toward morning. The morning is still hours away. There is no need to meet it. In the houses we have walked through tonight, in the parlours and the morning rooms and the gardens and the cemeteries, the lamps have all gone out. The women we have been visiting are all by now asleep, or are no longer with us at all, having taken their leave with the same quiet competence with which they took their leave of every room they ever entered. The doors are closed, the windows are dark, the keys are in their drawers, the accounts are in order. The houses themselves, in their quiet way, have settled into the kind of sleep that old houses are capable of. The wooden beams have stopped their small evening creaks. The pipes in the walls have ceased their occasional small ticks. The clocks on the various mantels have all reached by now the same slow part of the night, and they all tick together in a slow uneven chorus, no two of them perfectly synchronized, but all of them within the same broad range, all of them keeping the kind of rough collective time that a great household keeps when there is no one awake to listen to any single one of them. The cat in the kitchen has curled into the warm spot near the stove. The dog in the back hall has stretched out on his blanket with his nose against the door. The mice in the pantry, who have come out as they always do at this hour, are doing their small busy work among the crumbs, with no one to disturb them, and they will retreat again before the cook comes down at 5 into the small hidden runways behind the walls. Above, in the upper rooms, the people of the household are at rest. The lady is asleep in her great curtained bed, with her hair in its careful braid for the night, and her hands folded under her chin in the small habitual gesture she has used since girlhood. Her husband, in his own room down the hall, is asleep on his side, breathing the slow, steady breath of a man who has worked his life and earned his rest. The children, those who are still children, are asleep in the nursery wing under the watchful eye of the night nurse, who is herself dozing in the small chair by the door. The servants, in the upper attic floors, are asleep in their small narrow beds, dreaming of the small particular dreams that servants dream, dreams of villages they came from, of mothers they have not seen in years, of small futures they may or may not, in due course, see realized. The whole great vertical structure of the household is at rest, top to bottom, in the kind of completed nightly silence that arrives, in any well-run house, only briefly, only once, only in the very deepest hour, before the first signs of the next day begin. You may rest as well now. The night will hold the house will hold the people in their nightly forgetting of everything they have to manage in the day will rest as deeply as their lives allow, and you, listening,